The past was never fully solved. Ruins appear where they shouldn't. Objects turn up in places that make no sense. Civilizations vanish without clear explanation. What remains isn't just history. It's a set of mysteries that still resist understanding. Over the next 3 hours, we will move through some of the most unsettling and beautiful unresolved mysteries the ancient world has left us. Not to solve them, but to experience them. So sit back, let the world outside fall quiet, and descend into the darkness. The palace of Phaistos sits on a low hill in the southern Crete, surrounded by the bleached stillness of the Masara plain. Olive trees press against the ruins like elderly witnesses. The sky above is vast and flat and blue, the kind of blue that makes the ancient stone seem almost luminous in comparison. The wind moves through the site with a soft, purposeful insistence, as if it is trying to turn pages. Somewhere beneath your feet, 2,000 years of silence have compacted into the limestone itself. Phaistos was one of the great Minoan palace complexes of Bronze Age Crete, reaching its height between approximately 1900 and 1450 BCE. The site was excavated by Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier, beginning in 1900, at the same moment Arthur Evans was unearthing Knossos to the north. The Minoans were among the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations of their era, trading across the entire Mediterranean basin. In 1908, in a small basement chamber of the palace ruins, Pernier's team found a fired clay disc approximately 16 centimeters in diameter. Both sides were covered in a continuous spiral of stamped pictographic symbols, 241 individual tokens, composed of 45 distinct signs. The symbols were pressed into the clay while it was wet, using what appear to be pre-formed stamps, making the Phaistos Disc possibly the earliest example of movable type in human history. No one has ever read it. The disc is unique. It suggests a highly formalized symbolic system. The regularity and repetition of certain signs point toward a structured written language rather than decorative art. Yet no other artifact in the entire archaeological record of the Aegean world uses the same symbols, making comparative decipherment impossible. The signs themselves depict recognizable forms: a walking man, a helmeted head, a plumed figure, a fish, a beehive. This suggests the system is logographic or syllabic, yet the meaning of each sign in relation to its neighbors remains entirely opaque. The direction of reading appears to move from the outer edge inward toward the center, based on the way the symbols cluster. Yet this tells us nothing about the phonetic or semantic value of a single token. Chemical analysis confirms the disc was fired at high temperatures, preserving it for over 3,000 years. Yet the context of its discovery, a single sealed room, raises questions about whether it was a routine administrative document or something far more ceremonial. Was the Phaistos Disc a religious text, a legal code, a hymn, or something we have no modern category for? Why, in all the hundreds of thousands of Minoan artifacts recovered across Crete, at Knossos, at Akrotiri, at Malea, at dozens of smaller sites, does this one object stand entirely alone in its script, as if it arrived from somewhere the rest of the culture never touched? Did a lost civilization carry this language with them when they vanished, taking its key to the bottom of the sea? And what does it mean that the Minoans, who clearly could write, who left linear A inscriptions across the entire island, apparently had not one but at least two entirely separate writing systems, one of which we have partially mapped and one of which we cannot decipher at all? The dominant scholarly interpretation holds that the disc is a genuine artifact of Minoan or possibly pre-Minoan Aegean culture, likely a liturgical or administrative text. Most mainstream researchers believe it encodes a language in a syllabic script, similar in structure to Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan writing system that post-dates the disc. The argument is compelling. The systematic repetition of sign groups, the consistency of symbol form, and the careful spiral layout all suggest intentional linguistic encoding rather than decorative invention. Yet then, we confront the question of why, across all of Minoan civilization, not a single matching inscription has ever been found anywhere else on Earth. The disc's absolute uniqueness is precisely what makes scholarly consensus impossible. A language, by its very nature, requires a community of users, yet this is the only surviving trace of its community. It is either the sole surviving relic of a vast lost literature, or something far stranger, a single object created for a single purpose that required this script only once. Could it be that the Phaistos Disc was not Minoan at all, but rather the product of a traveling scribe from a civilization whose homeland lay beyond the Aegean, perhaps in Anatolia or the Levant, who brought a writing system that never took root on Cretan soil? Might it have been a ritual object intentionally encoded in a private or sacred script, designed to be unreadable by anyone outside a specific priestly caste? What if the disc was not meant to be read by humans at all, but rather offered as a message to something older than writing itself, pressed into clay as prayer is pressed into silence? Imagine the hands that made this disc, a craftsman somewhere in Bronze Age Crete, pressing each stamp deliberately into wet clay with the careful precision of someone who knows that what they are recording matters. They knew what those signs meant. They lived inside the language as we live inside our own breath, unconsciously, completely, without the need for explanation. Every sign pressed into that clay was as unremarkable to them as the letters on this page are to you, just the ordinary texture of thought made visible. And now we stand on the hill above Phaistos 3,000 years later, holding their words and unable to speak a syllable of them. This is not merely a linguistic puzzle. It is the distillation of everything that makes human history feel simultaneously near and impossibly remote. We are always almost touching the past. We can hold the disc, the actual object, fired in the actual kiln, pressed by the actual fingers of the person who made it. And yet, there's always this thin, maddening layer of silence between their intention and our comprehension. The disc exists, the meaning does not, and perhaps that gap, that small, dark space between symbol and sense, is the most honest portrait of time that archaeology has ever produced. We reach across it constantly. We never quite arrive. As the Masara wind turns over the clay-colored stones of Phaistos, our journey carries us westward across the Pacific, to a place even more isolated, even more stripped of context. A small volcanic island where a people created a script no living linguist has been able to revive, and where the last person who could have taught us to read it died with the knowledge sealed inside them like a disk of fired clay. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, rises from the southeastern Pacific like the tip of a drowned mountain. The sky here is enormous, uninterrupted by anything except the horizon, and the horizon is everywhere. The grass rolls in the wind like an animal breathing. The great stone moai stand with their backs to the sea, staring inland with expressions that read neither as welcome nor as warning, only as weight. The island is beautiful the way isolation is beautiful, completely and without comfort. There is the sound of wind and the sound of ocean, and between them, silence stretching in every direction. Easter Island, roughly 3,700 kilometers from the coast of Chile, was settled by Polynesian voyagers approximately between 300 and 1200 CE. At its height, the Rapa Nui civilization supported a population in the thousands, constructing the iconic Moai platforms and maintaining a complex social and religious order. European contact began in 1722 with the arrival of Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen on Easter Sunday, an encounter that would cascade into catastrophe for the island's people. Carved onto wooden tablets across the island are rows of compact, intricate pictographic symbols arranged in alternating lines, a script known as Rongorongo, discovered formally in the 1860s by missionaries who found the islanders possessed tablets whose meaning they could no longer fully recall. Only 27 objects bearing this script survive in collections worldwide. The few islanders who appeared to have any residual knowledge of the script died shortly after European contact, during an era of slave raiding, smallpox, and forced deportation that nearly erased the entire Rapa Nui population. The key went with them. Rongorongo is written in reverse boustrophodon. Each line is read in alternating directions, rotating the tablet 180 degrees between lines. This structural regularity suggests a sophisticated scribal convention. Yet no comparative script exists anywhere in Polynesia, making Rongorongo a complete linguistic isolate. Some scholars have identified what appear to be lunar calendar notations among the symbols, yet this interpretation has never achieved consensus, and the phonetic values of the signs remain entirely hypothetical. One partial correlation has been found. A creation chant recorded from oral tradition appears to match a sequence on one tablet. Yet this single thread accounts for only a fragment of the text and illuminates almost nothing about the broader system. The tablets themselves are made of various woods, some of which are not native to Easter Island. Yet whether this indicates trade, long voyages, or ritual importation remains unknown. Did Rongorongo develop independently on Easter Island, making it one of the very few instances of writing invented without outside influence in human history? A linguistic miracle born from the specific pressures of absolute isolation. Was the knowledge of the script already fading before European contact, lost to internal conflict and the ecological collapse that decimated the island's population? Or was it deliberately withheld from outsiders as sacred knowledge too dangerous to share? Is there anyone alive today, any unbroken thread of oral tradition in a community somewhere in Polynesia, who carries even one syllable of this language forward into the present, without knowing it? The prevailing academic view holds that Rongorongo was likely a mnemonic device, a system of pictographic prompts that helped trained chanters recall long sacred texts held primarily in memory, rather than a fully phonetic writing system. This interpretation explains why the tablet's meaning deteriorated so quickly after the social structures that supported them collapsed. The theory has considerable explanatory power. Many early writing systems in the world began as memory aids before evolving into fully phonetic scripts, and the Rapa Nui population's catastrophic decimation in the 1860s would have severed the transmission chain almost instantly. Yet then, we notice that the system's structural complexity, the boustrophodon reversal, the consistent sign groupings, the apparent internal grammar, exceeds what a simple mnemonic would require. A mnemonic device does not need rules, yet Rongorongo has rules. The signs follow patterns too consistent, too internally systematic, to be mere reminders. Something more deliberate was happening, something that required training, discipline, and a shared understanding of grammar. Whatever Rongorongo was, it was a technology, and technologies this sophisticated do not emerge without deep purpose. Could it be that Rongorongo preserves the fragments of a religious cosmology so specific to Rapa Nui, so rooted in the island's particular geography, its volcanic origins, its experience of being a single point of humanity surrounded by an infinite ocean, that its loss constitutes not just a linguistic tragedy, but a theological one, an entire understanding of the divine erased along with the people who held it? Might it have encoded navigational knowledge accumulated across centuries of Pacific voyaging? Star paths, current patterns, island chains separated by weeks of open ocean. Knowledge that died with the last navigators who could read both the tablets and the sea. What if the tablets were not created for the general population at all, but were the exclusive property of a priestly class whose initiatory knowledge was so intensely protected that its destruction was not an accident, but the inevitable consequence of its own secrecy, a system designed to survive any single death, but incapable of surviving the death of an entire society? There is a particular cruelty in the story of Rongorongo, not the cruelty of ancient mystery, the cool, impersonal cruelty of time consuming what it made, but the immediate, documented cruelty of human contact turning lethal. We know the names of the ships. We know the years. Scholars can identify the decade in which the last fluent reader almost certainly died, likely shivering in a Peruvian mine or a hold below decks, carrying inside them the only living key to one of the most isolated writing systems ever created. To study Rongorongo is not merely to face the limits of archaeology. It is to sit with a specific and terrible grief. Some silences are not ancient. Some were made last Tuesday by the ordinary mechanics of power. The tablets survive. But they survive the way a locked room survives a fire, intact, sealed, and utterly unreachable. As the Pacific wind pushes across Rapa Nui toward a horizon that offers no answers, our journey turns north and east, crossing continents and centuries until we arrive not at a carved stone or a sacred tablet, but at a book, a manuscript so strange, so internally consistent, and so completely impenetrable that it has been defeating the world's finest cryptographers for over 500 years. The Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University is a building designed to protect light as much as to let it in. Its translucent marble panels diffuse the New Haven sun into something amber, warm, and almost underwater. The silence inside is architectural, designed, enforced, absolute. Somewhere in the controlled climate of its vault, inside an acid-free case, lies a small 15th-century manuscript whose pages are covered with flowing script in an unknown language, accompanied by illustrations of plants that do not exist, astronomical diagrams that match no known system, and naked women bathing in green pools connected by organic tubing that belongs to no recognizable biology. It waits there, patient and impenetrable, like a mind that has decided not to speak. The Voynich Manuscript, named for antiquarian Wilfrid Voynich, who purchased it in 1912, is a vellum codex of approximately 240 pages, carbon dated to approximately 1404 to 1438 CE. It was likely produced somewhere in Central Europe during the early 15th century. Its provenance before the 17th century is essentially unknown, though a letter from 1666 suggests it passed through the hands of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, a fortune, suggesting someone believed it contained something extraordinary. Voynich brought the manuscript to the attention of scholars, cryptographers, and linguists, who immediately recognized its radical strangeness. The text flows in a confident, practiced hand, not the tentative marks of someone inventing symbols as they go, but the fluid strokes of someone writing in a script they know as intimately as a native language. The script has never been matched to any known writing system. The language it encodes, if it encodes a language, has never been identified. The plants illustrated in its botanical sections have never been matched to any species, living or extinct. It should not exist. Yet here it is, turning pages in the amber light. Statistical analysis of the text reveals that it follows Zipf's law, the mathematical distribution of symbol frequencies that governs all natural human languages. This suggests the manuscript encodes actual linguistic content rather than random nonsense. Yet the symbol frequency patterns differ subtly from any known language, placing it in a statistical space that is human but unidentifiable. The manuscript's illustrations are divided into botanical, astronomical, biological, cosmological, pharmaceutical, and recipe sections, a structure matching genuine medieval encyclopedias. Yet every single illustrated element is unrecognizable. The vellum is genuine 15th century material, yet the pigments used in some illustrations have been analyzed and found to include compounds whose exact combinations are difficult to place with certainty. The text flows left to right, without erasures. Yet experienced cryptographers, including those who broke Nazi Enigma codes, spent years attempting decipherment and failed entirely. Is the Voynich manuscript an encrypted text in a real but lost language, or an elaborate hoax designed with such meticulous linguistic verisimilitude that it fooled statistical algorithms? If it is a hoax, who had the knowledge, the patience, and the motivation to construct something this internally consistent? And if it is not a hoax, if somewhere inside those 240 pages is an actual message, what in the world does it say? The most credible contemporary scholarly view, supported by recent computational analysis, holds that the Voynich manuscript is a genuine encoded text, possibly a cipher applied to a real language, possibly an invented language with consistent internal grammar, or possibly a highly abbreviated notation system used by a specific medieval professional community, such as alchemists, physicians, or astrologers. The argument is supported by the genuine complexity of the system, the consistency of its internal structure, and the sheer impracticality of producing a 240-page hoax with no evident audience, no documented patron, and no apparent financial benefit. Forgers in the 15th century had clear incentives: prestige, money, or the advancement of a specific claim. The Voynich manuscript satisfies none of these conditions. Yet then, linguist Gordon Rugg demonstrated in 2004 that a simple medieval device called a cardan grilla, a card with holes cut into it, drawn across a table of syllables, could have generated text that mimics the statistical properties of natural language without encoding anything at all, producing in hours what the manuscript's scribe produced across 240 pages, and what might have been years of effort. If Rugg is right, then the Voynich manuscript is a monument to meaninglessness, a perfectly structured void, a text that successfully impersonates a language without being one. But this conclusion feels insufficient in ways that are hard to articulate precisely. Someone spent months, possibly years, filling these pages with confident, unhesitating script, illustrating them with botanical drawings of impossible plants and astronomical diagrams of impossible skies. Why? For whom? A hoax requires a victim, or, at minimum, a purpose. There is no documented victim. There is no documented purpose. There is only the manuscript, beautiful and impenetrable, and the silence it has maintained with perfect composure across 600 years of interrogation. Could it be that the Voynich Manuscript is a genuine, personal encyclopedia, written by an autodidact in an invented private language? A constructed tongue devised by someone who wanted, above all else, to think in a language no one else could overhear? Might it have been a therapeutic or devotional text written by someone in extreme social danger? A heretic, a mystic, a woman practicing medicine, who encrypted their knowledge not from a known language, but from their own interior grammar, untraceable precisely because its roots were inside a single human mind. What if the botanical illustrations are not symbolic or fictional, but are accurate depictions of now extinct plants from a specific microenvironment, and the text is a field manual for a lost pharmacological tradition that died with its author? We live inside language. We use it so constantly, so unconsciously, that it becomes invisible, the water we swim in. But the Voynich Manuscript forces us to imagine language from the outside, to see it the way a stone sees a river, as something moving, purposeful, and utterly opaque. Whoever wrote this knew what they were writing. They had a reason. They had knowledge they wanted to preserve, or conceal, or offer, or shout into the void of the future. The most honest thing you can say about the Voynich Manuscript is that someone meant something by it. We just cannot find our way inside. And perhaps that is what makes it beautiful, as much as maddening. The pure, uncrossable distance between one mind and another, made visible on a page. As we leave the amber vault of the Beinica and step back into ordinary light, our journey turns away from documents and toward landscape itself, toward a mystery not pressed into clay or scratched onto vellum, but carved into the living chalk of an English hillside, where a creature 3,000 years old still gallops through the grass without ever arriving anywhere. The Vale of the White Horse in Oxfordshire, England, rolls beneath a sky that cannot decide between grey and silver. The chalk downland here smells of wet grass and coal stone, and something older, something mineral and patient beneath the soil. Climb to the ridgeline above Uffington, and you look out over a valley floor so wide and green it seems to breathe. Then you turn, and there, carved into the steep chalk scarp below you, stretched across an area nearly 110 meters long, is a horse, or something shaped like a horse, composed of flowing white lines that seem to move even in stillness. No fence surrounds it. No museum glass contains it. It is simply there, as it has been for at least 3,000 years, galloping toward nothing in particular with extraordinary, disciplined speed. The Uffington White Horse is a stylized hill figure, cut into the chalk hillside of the Berkshire Downs, now Oxfordshire, likely created during the Late Bronze Age, between 1380 and 550 BCE, based on the analysis of sediment trapped in the figure's trenches. It is the oldest known chalk hill figure in Britain, and one of the most precisely maintained prehistoric monuments in Europe, kept visible through a tradition of scouring, the regular clearing of vegetation that has continued unbroken for thousands of years. Local folklore long associated this work with St. George and the Dragon, but the archaeology predates Christianity by more than a millennium. What makes Uffington genuinely strange is not merely its age, but its form. The horse, if that is what it is, bears almost no resemblance to a naturalistic horse. It is a series of flowing, disconnected chalk lines that suggest motion without rendering anatomy. The eye fills in the rest. It is this abstract quality, the sureness of its abstraction, that has led some researchers to compare it not to decorative art, but to cult imagery. The deliberate, distilled symbol of something the Bronze Age mind considered sacred, beyond the need for representation. You cannot see the full figure from the ground directly below it. The complete form is only legible from a distance or from the air. OSL, dating, optically stimulated luminescence, which measures when sediment was last exposed to light, places the figure's creation firmly in the Bronze Age, likely contemporary with the nearby hill fort at Uffington Castle. This suggests the horse was not a casual decoration, but a monument integrated into a larger sacred landscape. Yet, the purpose of that integration remains unknown. The figure's stylistic similarity to horses depicted on Bronze Age coins suggests a shared artistic vocabulary. Yet, coins came centuries later. If the white horse influenced coin iconography, it implies an image of sustained cultural power across multiple centuries, which raises more questions than it resolves. The site requires regular scouring to remain visible, a communal labor that has been maintained not by any single institution, but by the accumulated habit of generations. Yet who first organized that labor, and under what religious or social obligation, is entirely lost. The figure is oriented so that its gaze faces toward the rising sun at certain times of year. Yet, whether this is intentional astronomical alignment or coincidence cannot be definitively established. Why is the white horse designed to be invisible from immediately below? Was it made for gods, for distant travelers, for the dead, or for a future that had not yet arrived? What precise belief system required the carving of this specific symbol in this specific way into this specific hillside? And who decided, 3,000 years ago, that this image would be maintained forever? And why has that decision held? Most archaeologists interpret the white horse as a tribal totem or sacred emblem of the late Bronze Age community that occupied this region, possibly connected to a horse cult known to have been widespread across Celtic and Proto-Celtic Europe. The horse was a symbol of power, speed, solar energy, and divine favor across dozens of ancient European cultures, and the positioning of the Uffington figure within a landscape already dense with burial mounds and sacred enclosures supports its role as a ritual focal point. This is a coherent interpretation. Yet then we look at the figure itself, those abstract, disconnected lines, and we must ask whether this is a horse at all. Zoologists and art historians have both noted that the form is closer to a dragon, a stylized dog, or a cat than to any equid that has ever walked the earth. If the figure is not definitively a horse, then every interpretation built on horse symbolism collapses. The site would need to be reassessed entirely, its sacred meaning, its comparative context, its relationship to the coin imagery it supposedly influenced. The name White Horse is itself medieval, and the medieval English who named it may have been projecting an identity onto something they no longer fully understood. Could it be that the Uffington figure represents not a specific animal, but a concept, the idea of divine speed, the motion of a deity across the sky, and that its abstraction is not artistic limitation, but theological precision. Might it have served as a territorial marker visible to distant approaching communities, a kind of landscape-scale heraldry, declaring the identity and power of those who controlled this ridge? What if the scouring tradition was not preservation, but ongoing creation, each generation not maintaining the old image, but remaking it in their own hands, so that what we see today is less one Bronze Age carving than 3,000 years of continuous human intention pressed into the same chalk? Imagine a Bronze Age child lying in the grass above the Vale of the White Horse, watching the figure take shape beneath her as the community works below. She does not need to understand why this is done. She simply knows that it is done, that it has always been done, that when she is old, she will bring her own children here to watch. This is how civilizations maintain themselves, not through monuments alone, but through the agreement to keep returning. To scour the White Horse is to insist against the patient indifference of time, that some shapes are worth preserving even when their meaning has been forgotten. That insistence is itself a kind of message, and it has been received across 3,000 years by every generation that picked up a tool and cleared away the grass. As the chalk figure holds its impossible stillness against the Oxfordshire sky, our journey pivots westward across the Atlantic toward the tangled jungles of Central America, where an object surfaced without provenance or explanation. An object so beautiful, so technically improbable, and so thoroughly entangled in fraud and legend that its very existence has become a kind of mirror held up to human credulity. The jungle around Lubantun in Belize moves with a slow, humid deliberateness. The canopy closes overhead like a vault of green stone, filtering the light into something tropical and diffuse. The ruins here are unusual even by Mesoamerican standards, constructed without mortar, the great stone blocks fitted together with a dry precision that has survived centuries of earthquake and root intrusion. The site is quiet in a way that feels watched. The air smells of bark and standing water, and something darker beneath, something that might be the ordinary decomposition of leaves, but feels, in this light, more ceremonial. The jungle has not surrendered this place entirely. It has simply agreed to share it. Lubantun is a Maya ceremonial center in the Toledo district of present-day Belize, occupied primarily between approximately 700 and 900 CE during the late Classic Maya period. The site was excavated beginning in 1903, with major work conducted by Thomas Gann in 1915 and a British Museum expedition in 1926 to 1927, led by Thomas Joyce. The ruins consist of 5 main plazas and 11 major structures, and have yielded numerous artifacts of genuine archaeological significance, including clay figurines and distinctive ceramic styles. In 1933, F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, an English adventurer who had participated in the 1926 expedition, claimed that his daughter Anna, then 17, discovered a crystal skull beneath an altar at Lubantun on her birthday. The skull is life-sized, carved from a single piece of clear quartz with extraordinary technical precision. The lower jaw is detachable. The skull is oriented so that light entering through the cranium refracts dramatically through the eye sockets, producing an effect that has been described by those who have seen it as genuinely unsettling. Mitchell-Hedges later wrote of it with theatrical awe. There is no record of the skull in the British Museum expedition's official documentation. Not a single field note. Not a mention. The skull's technical quality is extraordinary. The quartz is optically pure, oriented against its natural crystal axis in a way that would require sophisticated knowledge of the material. This suggests an experienced lapidary working with quality tools. Yet the British Museum possesses a similar crystal skull of confirmed 19th century European manufacture, raising the possibility that the Mitchell-Hedges skull was produced during a period of commercial crystal carving rather than ancient Mesoamerican craft. Gemological analysis conducted in the 1990s detected microscopic surface markings consistent with rotary modern tools, not stone or obsidian instruments available in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Yet the skill required to produce this skull even with modern tools is formidable, and the intentionality of its design, the detachable jaw, the optical properties of the eye sockets, suggests something more than a mere commercial piece. Anna Mitchell-Hedges maintained until her death in 2007 that she personally found the skull in Lubantun. Yet no independent witness from the expedition ever confirmed this, and the skull appeared in a 1943 auction catalogue before any formal claim was made about its discovery. If the skull is a 19th century European manufacture, as evidence increasingly suggests, who made it? Who sold it to Mitchell-Hedges? And why was the elaborate Lubantun discovery story constructed and maintained for nearly 80 years? If it is somehow pre-Columbian, what technology produced markings that only microscopic analysis can detect? And why, after all the scientific examination, does the skull continue to feel, when you look at it, like it is looking back? The overwhelming consensus among archaeologists and materials scientists is that the Mitchell-Hedges skull, like all known crystal skulls including those held at the British Museum and the Smithsonian, was manufactured in Europe, most likely Germany, during the 19th century, using lapidary techniques and rotary tools that were widely available at the time. The skulls were likely produced for the antiquities market, which had a significant appetite for exotic pre-Columbian objects in the 19th century, and the Mitchell-Hedges skull was probably purchased by its namesake at auction and later repositioned as a dramatic discovery. This is a tidy and well-supported explanation. Yet then, we ask why someone with Mitchell-Hedges' profile, an adventurer who did not need invented relics to build a reputation, would risk the elaborate and specific lie of a jungle discovery. The problem is not the skull. It is the story. Provenance frauds of this kind usually have a clear motive: money, fame, or validation of a predetermined theory. Mitchell-Hedges was already famous, already well-funded, and had no particular Maya theory to advance. The persistence and specificity of Anna's testimony, maintained without a variation for over 70 years, does not feel like casual invention. Something about this story has a shape that ordinary fraud does not explain. Could it be that the skull was indeed purchased on the antiquities market and then physically planted at Lubantun by Mitchell-Hedges, not as fraud, but as a private ceremony, a kind of theatrical gift to his daughter, a birthday discovery staged in the ruins of a civilization, and that the discovery story was then repeated so many times it calcified into belief? Might the optical properties of the skull have made it genuinely significant to ancient Maya practitioners as a divination tool, regardless of its origins? a portable oracle purchased, used, and venerated precisely because of what it showed you. What if the skull's real mystery is not where it was made, but what it does to the human mind that looks into it, and what that tells us about the specific neurology of awe? There is a version of this story that is purely disappointing. A forged provenance, a purchased skull, a lie repeated until it became legend. But there is another version that is quietly profound. Anna Mitchell-Hedges held this object for over 70 years, traveling with it, exhibiting it, speaking about it with absolute conviction. Whether or not she found it in the jungle, she carried it, and what she carried, and what thousands of people felt when they looked into those quartz eye sockets, was not nothing. The skull became real through devotion. What does it mean that an object's meaning can be entirely constructed and yet still be felt? What does it mean that we cannot always tell the difference between a genuine artifact and a perfect replica of one, and that perhaps the feeling it produces does not require us to? As the crystal skull gazes from its case into whatever it has always been gazing at, our journey turns westward across the Pacific and then north, climbing through millennia into the heart of ancient China, where princes and kings were laid to rest inside suits of jade, convinced, or perhaps merely hoping, that immortality was a matter of the right materials assembled in the right order. The province of Jiangsu in eastern China is a landscape of flat rivers and winter light, of ancient canals cutting through plains that have been cultivated for so long they seem to have forgotten any previous identity. The tombs here are not dramatic eruptions from the earth, no pyramids, no cliff faces, but gentle mounds in the landscape, barely distinguishable from the hills around them, keeping their interiors secret behind the ordinary surface of agricultural China. Beneath those mounds, however, in chambers cut from rock and sealed with stone, the Han dynasty buried its princes in objects of extraordinary ambition. Full suits of jade, assembled piece by piece, designed to do something that no amount of wealth or power has ever accomplished. The jade burial suits of the Han dynasty were used by members of the imperial family and high nobility between approximately 206 BCE and 220 CE. Over 20 complete or near-complete suits have been recovered across multiple excavation sites in Jiangsu, Hebei, and other provinces. Each suit was assembled from hundreds, sometimes over 2,000, individual jade plaques, cut and polished, and then connected using wire threaded through tiny drilled holes. The wire material indicated rank: gold for kings and princes, silver for senior nobles, bronze for lesser nobles. The suits were discovered in a series of 20th-century excavations, with the most complete and celebrated pair found in 1968 in Mancheng, Hebei, the tombs of Han Prince Liu Sheng and his consort Du Wan. Liu Sheng's suit contained 2,498 jade plaques connected by approximately 1.1 kilograms of gold wire. The level of craftsmanship required, the years of labor, the extraordinary cost of materials, speaks to an absolute conviction about what jade could do. That conviction was this: jade, believed by the Han to be the crystallized essence of mountains and rivers, could prevent the decomposition of the physical body. It could, quite literally, make the dead immortal. The bodies, when the tombs were opened, had dissolved completely into dust. The jade plaques themselves show extraordinary variation in quality within a single suit. Some are finely worked, others rougher, suggesting that production was divided among multiple workshops, working simultaneously under deadline. This suggests the suits were not made over a lifetime but assembled with urgency, perhaps after illness signaled an approaching death. Yet this urgency coexists with extraordinary precision. The plaques fit their wearer's body in anatomically specific ways, suggesting either careful measurement of the living body or expert adjustment by craftsmen who knew their patron well. Residue analysis in some tombs has found traces of mercury within the sealed chambers, used as a preservative or perhaps as a ritual purifier. Yet mercury in sufficient quantity is toxic, and its presence suggests the ancient Chinese were aware of its preserving properties, even as they used it in service of beliefs that archaeology has now definitively disproved. The suits were sealed inside lacquered coffins, nested within stone chambers, sealed with stone gates weighing several tons. Yet tomb robbers in antiquity penetrated almost every burial of this type, suggesting the seals were psychological as much as physical, barriers against the desecration of the afterlife, not effective barriers against the determined living. What did the craftsmen who drilled 2,000 jade plaques believe they were participating in? Did they share the theological conviction of the princes they were serving, or did they experience their labor purely as craft, as something done for payment rather than for transcendence? And when Liu Sheng was sealed inside his jade suit in the darkness of that stone chamber, what precisely did he believe would happen next? Scholars of Han Dynasty religion and material culture interpret the jade suits as the physical expression of a specific theological framework in which the human body, properly prepared and enclosed within spiritually potent materials, could resist the dissolution of death and preserve the individual's soul, the Hun and Po, long enough to achieve a permanent spiritual state. Jade was chosen specifically because of its cosmological associations with mountains, rivers, and the eternal continuity of the natural world. The suits represent not naivety, but a coherent, internally consistent belief about the relationship between matter and spirit. Yet then, we must sit with the fact that every person buried in a jade suit decomposed. Every single one. The princes knew this was possible. They had opened other tombs. They understood the evidence. And yet they built the suits anyway, not in ignorance of their inadequacy, but alongside it, which means the suits were not engineering. They were theology. And the question that follows from this is not whether the suits worked, but what kind of courage or need makes a person spend a lifetime preparing for something they have every reason to doubt. Could it be that the jade suits were not genuinely believed to prevent physical decomposition, but were rather a ritual statement, a declaration of status, intention, and belonging that made the act of preservation sacred regardless of its material effectiveness? Might the ritual labor of assembling thousands of plaques by hand have been the actual transformative act? The craftsman's accumulated intention being absorbed into the jade itself, so that what was buried was not just a body but the concentrated devotional energy of hundreds of human beings. What if the Han understanding of immortality was fundamentally different from ours? Not the preservation of the physical self, but the absorption of an individual identity into the eternal material of mountains, so that decomposing inside jade was not failure, but completion. Imagine the man, a craftsman, perhaps 30 years old, working in a government workshop in the capital, who drills the 947th jade plaque in Liu Sheng's suit. His hands are calloused from the work. He has been doing this for 8 months. He does not think about immortality particularly. He thinks about the alignment of the drill, about whether this plaque will sit flush against its neighbors, about what his family is eating tonight. And yet, somehow, what he is making is a monument to the human refusal to accept that consciousness ends. Every jade suit ever made was assembled, plaque by patient plaque, from the hope that love and labor and the right materials could defeat time. They could not. We know that now. But the suits remain, and the hope that made them remains inside them, tangible as stone. As the jade dust of the Han tombs settles back into Jiangsu's flat, riverine silence, our journey turns westward and backward, crossing mountains and millennia, until we arrive at the base of a volcano in southern Italy, where a library buried alive beneath ash and pumice may still contain, in sealed chambers we have not yet opened, the lost literature of the ancient world. The Bay of Naples on a clear winter day is a study in violent serenity. The water is silver and still, and Vesuvius rises above it with an almost domestic composure, its broad shoulders cloaked in green, its summit trailing a thin white thread of vapor. It is difficult, standing on this shore, to believe what happened here. The mountain does not look like a monster. It looks like a landscape painting. But beneath the ground at Herculaneum, 3 kilometers from Vesuvius's base, in a layer of carbonized organic matter 12 meters deep, there lies what may be the most significant undiscovered library in the history of human civilization. And we have not yet read most of it. Herculaneum was a wealthy Roman resort town on the Bay of Naples, destroyed along with Pompeii in the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. Unlike Pompeii, which was buried in ash and pumice, Herculaneum was entombed in a pyroclastic surge, a wave of superheated gas and volcanic material moving at extreme speed that carbonized organic material rather than simply burying it. This carbonization, paradoxically, preserved wood, fabric, food, and most significantly, papyrus scrolls in a state that no other ancient site has replicated. In 1752, workers tunneling beneath the modern town of Resina broke into what turned out to be the library of a magnificent villa, now known as the Villa of the Papyri, and found over 1,800 rolled papyrus scrolls stacked on wooden shelves, carbonized into fragile black cylinders that crumbled at the touch. The initial unrolling attempts destroyed more than they revealed. What survives has been read partially and agonizingly over the following 2.5 centuries. The scrolls recovered so far contain primarily philosophical texts, mostly Epicurean philosophy, from a surprisingly narrow range of authors. But the villa was vast, and we have excavated only a fraction of it. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries confirmed that substantial unexcavated sections of the Villa of the Papyri remain beneath the modern town, including rooms that almost certainly contain additional scrolls arranged on wooden shelving similar to what was found in the excavated sections. Yet, the modern town of Ercolano sits directly above these rooms, and excavating them would require either demolishing existing structures or developing tunneling technology far more precise and less destructive than what was available in previous decades. Recent advances in multispectral imaging and X-ray phase contrast tomography, developed in part specifically for the Herculaneum scrolls, funded in part by private technology philanthropy, have allowed researchers to read text from inside sealed scroll cylinders without physically unrolling them, a breakthrough that would have seemed miraculous to the 18th century unrollers who destroyed half of what they touched. Yet the process is extraordinarily slow and technically demanding, and the number of scrolls still awaiting analysis runs into the hundreds, with each scroll requiring months of computational work for even partial legibility. The scrolls recovered in the 18th century were from a private philosophical library, almost certainly curated for a specific intellectual purpose. Yet scholars estimate that the typical villa library of this wealthened period would have contained far more diverse material: history, drama, political oratory, natural philosophy. The scrolls we found may be the selection least likely to surprise us. The scrolls still waiting beneath the streets may be everything else. Could the unexcavated rooms of the Villa of the Papyri contain lost works by Sophocles, lost books of Livy, lost Aristotelian dialogues that scholars have sought for centuries? If the Herculaneum Papyri project eventually reads every recoverable scroll from this villa, will we find ideas that would alter our understanding of ancient thought, or confirm how much has already been lost? And what is the moral calculation of the modern Italian town that sits unknowing above what may be the most important library in the world? The scholarly consensus holds that the Villa of the Papyri was the private library of Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, Julius Caesar's father-in-law and a patron of Epicurean philosophy, and that the recovered scrolls represent a curated collection of texts aligned with Epicurean intellectual tradition. The library is exceptional, but thematically focused. Most classicists believe the unexcavated areas likely contain more of the same, more philosophical texts, possibly additional works by known Epicurean authors. Yet then, the sheer scale of the villa, a building whose footprint exceeds that of most royal palaces of the period, suggests a library collection of proportions that no private philosophical specialization entirely explains. A building this large, owned by a man with this much political influence in the final decades of the Roman Republic, would not have contained only Epicurean philosophy. It would have contained the intellectual life of an entire era. And if we have recovered barely a tenth of its contents, we are not reading the Villa of the Papyri. We are reading its footnotes. Could it be that beneath the unexcavated rooms of the Villa of the Papyri lie scrolls containing Julius Caesar's own writings beyond what survived? Private letters, lost speeches, philosophical treatises he never published. Might there be scrolls from the library at Alexandria, acquired through the vast networks of Roman patronage, that preserve texts known only as titles in other ancient sources, complete plays by Menander, lost books of the Iliad's oral tradition, early Christian or Jewish texts predating any known manuscript? What if the Herculaneum scrolls, fully read, would not merely fill gaps in our knowledge of antiquity, but fundamentally restructure our understanding of which ideas were central and which were marginal in the ancient world? In 79 CE, as the pyroclastic surge rolled across the Bay of Naples at 200 kilometers per hour, the last person in the Villa of the Papyri had perhaps a few seconds of awareness before everything ended. They could not save the scrolls. They could not even save themselves. But the mountain, in the act of destroying, preserved. And what it preserved was not only papyrus. It preserved the possibility that the conversation is not over, that somewhere in the carbonized darkness beneath a modern Italian street, there are words waiting to be read that have been waiting for 2,000 years. Every unread scroll is a sentence left hanging in the middle of a thought, and the thought is still there, patient as ash, waiting for someone to finish it. As the volcanic light fades over the Bay of Naples and the modern town of Ercolano goes about its business above its extraordinary secret. Our journey turns northward across the Alps and into the fields of central Germany, where a farmer's plow struck something bronze and blue and ancient, an object that should not have existed in the time and place it was found. The Ziegelrode forest in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany, is the kind of woodland that seems to remember things. The trees press close together with an old, unhurried density. The light that filters through in summer is green and liquid, and the undergrowth holds the moisture of ancient seasons. The hills here are gentle and unassuming, not the dramatic ridges of alpine Europe, but something quieter, a landscape that keeps its secrets in the manner of a person who has simply decided not to speak. Beneath one of these hills, for over 3,000 years, 2 swords, 2 axes, a chisel, 2 spiral armlets, and a bronze disc covered in gold lay buried together in deliberate arrangement, waiting for the specific accident that would bring them back into the world. The Nebra sky disc was discovered in 1999 by illegal treasure hunters using metal detectors on the Mittelberg Hill near the town of Nebra in Saxony-Anhalt, eastern Germany. After passing through several illegal antiques transactions, it was seized by Swiss authorities in 2002 and returned to Germany. Scientific analysis confirmed it was genuine. A bronze disc approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, making it the oldest known realistic astronomical representation of the cosmos in the world. It predates similar representations from the ancient Near East and Egypt by several centuries. The disc is bronze, patinated to a deep blue-green by 3.5 millennia underground. On its surface, gold leaf features mark the celestial vault, a full circle, the sun or full moon, a crescent, a lunar crescent or perhaps the moon in eclipse, and 32 small dots, stars, including a cluster of 7 that corresponds precisely to the Pleiades. Along the disk's edges, 2 gold arcs mark the horizon positions of the solstice sunrises and sunsets at the latitude of Mittelberg. A bottom arc, added later, has been interpreted as a solar boat, the vessel of a deity crossing the sky. Someone, in 1600 BCE Bronze Age Europe, was doing advanced observational astronomy. They were also doing something more. The Pleiades cluster depicted on the disk was critical to Bronze Age European agriculture. Its appearance at dusk in late February marked the time to begin plowing. Its disappearance in autumn marked the end of the harvest season. This suggests the disk served as a practical astronomical calendar. Yet its craftsmanship far exceeds what a purely utilitarian agricultural tool requires, implying that the cosmological information was also sacred. The 2 horizon arcs span exactly the angular distance between the northernmost and southernmost sunset positions at Mittelberg's latitude across the year. An angular observation that requires years of systematic record-keeping to establish accurately. Yet there is no other known evidence of systematic astronomical record-keeping in Central Europe at this period. The disk shows evidence of deliberate modification over time. Features were added, and at least one feature appears to have been removed. Yet, the logic of these changes, and who made them over what time span, cannot be traced. Who were the astronomical observers in Bronze Age Europe, precise enough to measure the solstice arc to the degree? Was the Nebra disk produced in Central Europe by a community with sophisticated astronomical knowledge, whose other works have not survived? Or was it imported? A finished object, traded across vast distances from a culture whose astronomical tradition is better documented. And what happened to the knowledge that made this disk? Why did it leave no successors? The archaeological consensus holds that the Nebra sky disk was produced in Central Europe, likely by a community of the Unnetis culture, one of the most sophisticated Bronze Age cultures of Central Europe, known for long-distance trade networks and metalworking of high quality. The disk reflects genuine astronomical observation accumulated over generations and encoded into a ritual object that served both practical, calendrical, and religious purposes. Its burial with weapons suggests it was the property of an individual of great status, a chieftain or priest who combined political, military, and cosmological authority. This is compelling. Yet then we note that the Unnetis culture left no other astronomical records of any comparable sophistication anywhere in its extensive archaeological record. The disk is not just advanced for its time and place. It is isolated. It has no predecessors and no successors in its cultural context. Objects this sophisticated do not emerge from nowhere. They require traditions of observation, apprenticeship, institutional knowledge. Yet the tradition that produced the Nebra disk left no other trace. It is as if the disk fell, fully formed, from the sky it depicts. Could it be that the Nebra disk was produced by a specific itinerant tradition of astronomical priests, analogous to the Druids who would emerge in the same region over a millennium later, who maintained their knowledge in oral and ritual form so successfully that the disk is the only material artifact their tradition left behind? Might the disk have been traded from a Mediterranean culture with advanced astronomical traditions, the Minoans perhaps, or a Near Eastern tradition, whose craft knowledge was absorbed locally and then produced this single extraordinary object? What if the Mittelberg Hill was chosen specifically as the disk's burial site because of pre-existing astronomical alignments at that location, and the disk's burial was not a loss but a gift, a return of cosmic knowledge to the Earth from which the knowledge of the Earth was taken? Imagine the astronomer, or priest, or perhaps both, since in this world the roles were inseparable, who stood on the Mittelberg Hill 3,600 years ago and watched the Pleiades, night after night, year after year, tracking the precise angle of the sunset on the horizon, marking it on a tool made of the most precious materials their culture possessed, because they understood, in their bones, in their religion, in their agriculture, that the sky was not decoration. It was a calendar. It was a god. It was a message that required extraordinary patience to learn to read. The Nebra sky disk is not just a map of the heavens. It is proof that someone, 3,000 years before the first telescope, was looking up with systematic devotion. Whatever we call that, science, religion, or something for which we have no modern category, it was not ignorance. It was attention. As the forest night closes over the Mittelberg Hill and the stars wheel overhead in patterns the disk's makers would have recognized, our journey carries us southeast across Europe and into the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where an object found near Baghdad has sparked one of the most contentious debates in the history of experimental archaeology. A clay vessel that may have held the first electrical current ever deliberately generated by human hands. The village of Kujut Rabu near Baghdad lies in a landscape that is all flat sky and river dust. The ancient alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates have deposited their silt for 10,000 years into a ground that has been farmed, built upon, and buried over so many times that every shovelful of earth contains multiple civilizations. The light here is white and relentless in summer, the kind of light that flattens shadows and makes the landscape look like a photograph of itself. The Parthian settlement, buried beneath this agricultural plain, was no great city, but in one of its simple earthen buildings, in a pot barely 14 centimeters tall, someone may have assembled the world's first intentional electrical device. The Baghdad Battery, more precisely, the Kujut Rabu Battery, is a ceramic vessel approximately 14 centimeters tall, containing an iron rod inserted through a copper cylinder. It was found by German archaeologist Wilhelm König during excavations near Baghdad in 1936 and dated to the Parthian period, approximately 250 BCE to 224 CE. König published a paper in 1938 proposing that the vessel was an ancient galvanic cell, a primitive battery capable of generating a small electrical current when filled with an acidic liquid such as wine vinegar or citric acid. The archaeological world has been arguing about it ever since. The vessel itself is undramatic: a clay jar, a copper tube, an iron rod. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might mistake it for a storage container or a simple candle holder. But when German museum curator Arne Egebrecht reportedly filled a replica with grape juice in 1978 and used it to electroplate a small silver statuette, completing the task in a fraction of the time required by conventional ancient methods, the object's implications became suddenly enormous. If the Baghdad Battery generated electricity in antiquity, then either electrical knowledge was developed and then completely lost, or the object is not a battery at all. Both possibilities are, in their different ways, extraordinary. Replicas of the Baghdad Battery have generated voltages of approximately 0.5 to 2 volts when filled with acidic electrolytes, sufficient for small-scale electroplating, but not for any other practical application known from the ancient world. Yet no electroplated objects have ever been found in confirmed Parthian archaeological contexts, which would be the primary evidence required to confirm the device was used for this purpose. The sealed copper tube and iron rod assembly is structurally similar to other Parthian vessels that clearly held papyrus scrolls. The iron rod held the scroll, and the copper cylinder protected it from insects through the natural production of copper salts. Yet, the specific materials and configuration of the Kujut Rabu vessel are slightly different from the scroll holders, and the combination of iron and copper in a clay vessel is not standard for any other known Parthian storage purpose. Experiments have confirmed the electrical potential, yet potential and purpose are not the same thing. Did Parthian craftsmen stumble upon electrochemical principles and develop practical applications that have left no trace in the archaeological record? Or was this vessel used for something so mundane, scroll storage, food preservation, that the entire electrical interpretation is an elegant solution to a problem that did not exist? And if the battery was used for electroplating, where are the electroplated objects? The dominant archaeological view holds firmly that the Baghdad Battery was a scroll storage jar, a well-documented Parthian vessel type, used to preserve papyrus documents from moisture and insects. The acidic environment created by the combination of certain stored materials and the copper cylinder was a side effect, not an intention. Most mainstream archaeologists reject the battery interpretation as a case of anachronistic pattern matching, projecting modern electrical knowledge onto an ancient object and misidentifying its function. The scroll jar explanation is supported by clear parallels in the archaeological record. Yet then we must explain why this specific vessel's configuration, the iron rod, the copper cylinder, the clay seal, differs from all other confirmed scroll jars in ways that have no clear functional explanation within the scroll storage framework. The scroll jar theory requires us to accept a series of material choices that are unnecessary for scroll preservation, specifically the use of iron in combination with copper in a configuration that maximizes galvanic potential. Parsimony cuts both ways. The simplest explanation should not require us to ignore the very features that make the object unusual. Could it be that Parthian metalworkers discovered the electroplating effect empirically by noticing that certain metal objects left in acidic liquids became coated with other metals, and developed a controlled application without any theoretical understanding of electricity, the way many ancient technologies developed through observation rather than theory? Might the Baghdad Battery represent a tradition of electrochemical knowledge that existed within a specific guild of craftsmen, transmitted orally and practically, and erased when that guild was disrupted by war or political change? What if there are additional examples of this vessel type in museum storage worldwide that have been miscatalogued as scroll holders, and a systematic re-examination of Parthian ceramics would reveal a battery tradition that was never recognized as such? There is something vertiginous about the Baghdad Battery that goes beyond the question of whether it generated electricity. It is the question of how many other capabilities the ancient world possessed and lost, not because they were impossible, but because the chain of transmission was broken. Knowledge is more fragile than stone. A dynasty collapses, a guild disperses, a city burns, and a technology that took generations to develop evaporates in a single generation because it lived in hands and voices rather than in books. The Baghdad Battery does not prove that the ancient world was more advanced than we imagined. It proves that we should not assume it was less so. The difference is subtle but important, and the silence of the missing electroplated objects is not proof of absence. It is, as always, just silence. As the river dust of the Mesopotamian plain settles over the simple clay jar and its enormous implications, our journey turns southwest into the timeless corridor of the Nile Valley, where a temple ceiling bears a circular stone map of the sky so sophisticated, so unexpected in its precision, that scholars have been arguing about when it was made, and by whom, for over 2 centuries. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera rises from the Egyptian desert with the particular authority of a building that has never fully accepted the passage of time. Its sandstone facade catches the late afternoon light and holds it, warm and reddish gold, before releasing it slowly into the cooling evening air. The hypostyle hall inside is a forest of massive columns, each one covered floor to ceiling in painted relief that even now, after centuries of Christian iconoclasm, black smoke, and amateur excavation, retains fragments of color: ochre, cobalt, a faded turquoise. The ceiling here has absorbed the darkness of 2,000 years of lamp smoke, and in one of the inner chambers, cut from the living stone of the ceiling, there is a round zodiac that stopped several generations of scholars cold. The Dendera temple complex in Upper Egypt was built primarily during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, roughly 54 BCE to 20 CE, though it sits on foundations and ritual traditions that are considerably older. The Temple of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and the sky, is one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian temple complexes in existence. The famous Dendera Zodiac, a circular bas-relief approximately 1.5 meters in diameter, was carved into the ceiling of a small chapel on the temple roof and was removed by French antiquarians in 1821 and replaced with a plaster cast. The original now resides in the Louvre. The zodiac depicts the night sky as a circular map, with constellations, planets, and celestial bodies arranged in relationships that have allowed modern astronomers to calculate the specific sky it records. The figures are distinctly hybrid, some purely Egyptian, some Babylonian, some Greek, suggesting a synthesis of astronomical traditions that was characteristic of the cosmopolitan intellectual climate of Ptolemaic Egypt. The presence of zodiacal symbols in an Egyptian religious context was already surprising, but the real controversy emerged when scholars tried to determine precisely which sky the Dendera Zodiac depicted, and found that the answers pointed in multiple conflicting directions simultaneously. The positions of the planets and the eclipse symbols on the Dendera Zodiac have been analyzed by multiple teams of astronomers using precession calculations to identify the specific historical date that best matches the depicted sky. The most widely accepted result places the sky shown at approximately 50 BCE. Yet the temple itself was built over several decades, beginning in 54 BCE, and whether the zodiac was carved at the temple's foundation or added later during renovation cannot be established with certainty. The zodiac includes figures that appear to combine Greek zodiacal tradition with Egyptian astronomical deities in ways that are not fully explained by any single theoretical framework. Yet, the synthesis is too systematic to be accidental. It reflects deliberate intellectual effort to harmonize competing astronomical traditions. The zodiac also includes what appear to be 5 planetary alignments, positions of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn that correspond to an alignment calculable to a specific date. Yet experts disagree on which date this is, with proposals ranging from 50 BCE to 700 BCE. Does the Dendera Zodiac record a specific astronomical event, an eclipse, a planetary conjunction, a cosmically significant night, as a kind of eternal timestamp on the temple's dedication? Or is it a generalized cosmological map, an idealized image of the universe rather than a record of an actual sky? And if it does record a specific moment, what happened on that night that made it worthy of being carved in stone for eternity? The scholarly consensus holds that the Dendera Zodiac is a religious and cosmological ceiling decoration created during the Ptolemaic period, blending Greek astrological tradition with Egyptian astronomical mythology in the syncretic style that characterized all Egyptian intellectual culture after Alexander's conquest. The astronomical precision in the zodiac reflects the sophisticated observational astronomy practiced by Greek and Egyptian scholars in Alexandria, one of the great centers of ancient astronomical knowledge, and was likely designed to depict a cosmologically ideal or ritually significant arrangement of the heavens connected to the temple's dedication or a specific religious festival. Yet then we examine the figures more closely and find Egyptian deities in postures and relationships that do not correspond to any known Ptolemaic ritual calendar. The zodiac synthesizes traditions that were not simply combined, they were negotiated. Someone with deep knowledge of both Egyptian and Greek astronomical tradition sat down and made deliberate decisions about which elements to include, which to modify, and which to create entirely new. that person was doing something more than decoration. They were making an argument about the cosmos, and we cannot quite determine what argument they were making. Could it be that the Dendera Zodiac was carved specifically to commemorate a planetary alignment that ancient Egyptian Greek astronomers identified as marking the beginning of a new cosmic era? A moment when the arrangement of the heavens signaled a fundamental change in the divine order of the world. Might the zodiac encode a calendrical system that integrated Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek astronomical traditions into a single unified model? A model that was never written down in text form and survives only in this single round stone ceiling. What if the specific deities depicted in non-standard postures are doing so because they are marking their positions in the sky on the commemorated night, so that reading the zodiac correctly requires knowing which deity corresponds to which celestial body in each tradition simultaneously? There is something almost tender about the Dendera Zodiac. A round stone ceiling in a small rooftop chapel where priests climbed in the pre-dawn hours to watch the sky from the temple roof, and where someone long ago arranged the entire cosmos into a circle, small enough to look at all at once. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Babylonians. In that zodiac, they are not separate traditions, but a single human act of looking upward. We have been trying to read the sky since before we had words for stars. We have been building systems to contain our awe since before we had philosophy to explain it. The Dendera Zodiac is not a map of the stars. It is a map of the human need to make the infinite manageable, and standing beneath it, even a plaster cast of it, you feel that need as a physical weight, pressing down from the ceiling like an entire sky compressed into stone. We have traveled across oceans and millennia, and the residue of a dozen civilizations, and we have not answered a single question we came with. The Phaistos Disc still spirals in silence. The Rongorongo Tablets still wait. The Voynich Manuscript still holds its breath, and the white horse still gallops across the chalk downs toward an arrival that never comes. But perhaps the persistence of these mysteries is not a failure of knowledge. Perhaps it is knowledge of a different kind, a reminder that the human need to make meaning is older than any of the systems we have invented to satisfy it, and that the systems themselves, the scripts, the suits, the sky maps, the stone animals, are less important than the impulse behind them. The impulse to say, I was here, I understood something, and I want you, whoever you are, to know. These mysteries persist not because the past conceals them, but because the past is still speaking. We have simply not yet learned to be quiet enough to hear. The Emerald Tablet exists in no surviving original form. There is no green stone in a museum case, no verified excavation site, no datable layer of earth from which it rose. It exists instead as a text, a short, dense, bewildering text that has been copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, from Arabic into Latin, into German, into English, into the margins of alchemical manuscripts, across 1,000 years of European intellectual history. And yet, the landscape that surrounds it has a physical reality. The Egyptian desert at Saqqara, where the Hermetic tradition that birthed the tablet's textual lineage first crystallized in the centuries after Alexander's conquest. A landscape of limestone and white sand and tombs cut from living rock, where the ancient and the invented press against each other with the same indifference that the desert presses against everything. The Emerald Tablet, Tabula Smaragdina, first appears in the historical record in Arabic sources from approximately the 6th to 8th century CE, attributed to the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic deity combining the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. The Hermetic tradition associated with this figure was developed in Alexandria during the 1st centuries CE, producing a body of philosophical, magical, and alchemical texts that were translated into Arabic, Latin, and eventually every major European language. The tablet became the foundational text of Western alchemy, the source of the famous axiom that served as the philosophical bedrock of Hermetic practice for over a millennium. The tablet's most famous line, in its various translations, asserts that what is above mirrors what is below, and what is below mirrors what is above, in the operation of the single miraculous thing. This macrocosm-microcosm principle became the organizing metaphysical framework for medieval and Renaissance natural philosophy, alchemy, astrology, and medicine. Newton owned multiple translations of the tablet and annotated them at length. The brief text, in its fullest versions, barely 300 words, was read as a compressed description of the entire theory of transformation, of base metal into gold, of mortal body into immortal soul, of the individual into the universal. And no one, in over 1,000 years of trying, has been able to establish with certainty who wrote it, when, or from what older tradition it emerged. The Arabic versions of the tablet predate any known Greek original, which is unusual. Most Hermetic texts were composed in Greek and translated into Arabic later. This suggests either that the tablet's origins are genuinely pre-Greek and were transmitted through Arabic-speaking cultures first, or that it was composed in the early Islamic period and its Greek origins are fictional. Yet the theological content is deeply consistent with Neoplatonist and Hermetic thought from the 1st centuries CE, which was primarily a Greek language intellectual tradition. The ascription to Hermes Trismegistus is a pseudepigraphical convention. Many texts were attributed to this legendary authority, which means the attribution tells us nothing about the actual author's identity. Yet, the consistency of the tablet across its many textual variants suggests it derived from a single original source rather than accumulating through editorial addition, implying a single author with a specific and coherent philosophical vision. The tablet's alchemical resonance caused it to be copied into virtually every major alchemical collection produced in Europe between the 12th and 18th centuries, a distribution so wide that establishing a textual genealogy has been nearly impossible. Was the Emerald Tablet composed by a single philosopher in the Alexandrian tradition who understood that attributing it to a divine authority would give it more influence than any human authorship could? Was there an actual object, a stone tablet inscribed with the original text, that was seen and copied before it was lost? Or has the tablet always been purely textual, its material existence invented to add authority to words? And does the principle the tablet expresses, the recursive mirroring of scales, the single operation underlying all transformation, describe something real about the structure of the universe? Or was it simply the most elegant metaphysical framework the ancient mind could construct? Historians of Hermeticism generally conclude that the Emerald Tablet was composed somewhere in the late antique Near Eastern world, most likely in an Arabic-speaking context, drawing on earlier Hermetic and Neoplatonic material from Alexandria, sometime between the 6th and 8th centuries CE. It was a literary forgery in the classical sense, not a deception intended to deceive financially, but a pedagogical and philosophical text deliberately attributed to divine authority to signal its participation in a sacred tradition and to ensure its reception as wisdom rather than mere opinion. This was common practice in late antiquity, and the tablet fits this pattern precisely. Yet, the specific philosophical content, the macrocosm-microcosm principle, the single operation of transformation, has proven extraordinarily generative, influencing not only alchemy, but the foundations of modern chemistry, the holographic principle in physics, and the systems thinking of the 20th century. A text composed to be attributed to divine authority usually reveals its human origins under close examination, an anachronism, a theological inconsistency, a vocabulary that betrays its period. The Emerald Tablet has been examined by some of the finest philological minds in history for over 8 centuries, and its origins remain genuinely uncertain. Either the forger was extraordinarily skilled, or the tablet's origins are more complex and more ancient than the simplest explanation allows. Could it be that the Emerald Tablet preserves, in compressed philosophical form, the central insight of an Egyptian or Babylonian cosmological tradition that was already ancient when Alexandria was founded, a principle transmitted orally through priestly lineages and crystallized into this compact text only when those lineages faced extinction? Might the text's apparent brevity be not its complete form, but its distillation, the surviving kernel of a longer exegetical tradition whose supporting commentary was lost, leaving only the axiom without its explanation? What if the tablet's macrocosm-microcosm principle is not metaphysical poetry, but a compressed technical insight, a genuine observation about the structure of natural systems that was intuited by ancient natural philosophers and is only now being independently rediscovered by complex systems science? Imagine a scholar in Alexandria, a woman, perhaps, since the Alexandrian tradition had its women scholars, though history has largely erased them, who has spent her life moving between Greek philosophy and Egyptian priestly tradition, learning from both, belonging fully to neither. She understands that the two traditions are saying the same thing in different languages. She wants to write it down in a form that can cross both boundaries. She writes the tablet. She attributes it to Hermes Trismegistus, because she knows that no text attributed to a woman philosopher in the ancient world would survive. Her insight would survive, sealed inside a divine attribution, carried forward by the men who never knew her name. The Emerald Tablet may be the most influential anonymous text in Western intellectual history, and the anonymity may have been precisely the price of its survival. As the desert light at Saqqara fades from white to the deep amber of evening, and the Hermetic tradition recedes into the same twilight that receives all things, our journey moves northward across the Mediterranean and into the cold forests of medieval Bohemia, where a monastery produced a book so enormous, so strange, and so internally contradictory that the medieval mind invented a supernatural explanation for it. And perhaps they were not entirely wrong. The Podlages Monastery no longer stands. It was destroyed in 1421 during the Hussite Wars that tore through Bohemia with the particular fury that religious conflicts tend to reserve for things they cannot convert. But it stood in the 13th century on a low hill in what is now the Czech Republic, surrounded by the birch and pine forests of Central Europe. A quiet Benedictine house, modest in scale and not particularly distinguished, the kind of place where monks lived out the long daily rhythm of liturgy, manuscript copying, and agricultural labor, and expected to be forgotten. They were not forgotten. They produced something that made sure of that. The Codex Gigas, Latin for Giant Bible, is a manuscript produced at the Podlazhitz Benedictine Monastery in Bohemia, in the present-day Czech Republic, dated to the early 13th century, approximately 1204 to 1230 CE. It is the largest medieval manuscript in the world, 92 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, and 22 centimeters thick, weighing approximately 74.8 kilograms. It requires 2 people to carry and cannot be opened to its full extent by 1 person alone. It originally contained 320 vellum leaves. 8 leaves were removed at an unknown point in history, and their contents are unknown. The Codex's fame rests on 2 things. First, its sheer scale. The parchment alone required the skins of approximately 160 donkeys, and the calligraphy throughout is so consistent that modern analysis using handwriting algorithms has confirmed it was written by a single scribe, suggesting a labor of 20 to 30 years or more, if produced at the ordinary pace of monastic manuscript production. Second, on a single page near the middle of the manuscript, surrounded by the religious texts and chronicles that make up the bulk of the work, there is a full-page portrait of the devil, a demonic figure occupying the entire page, red and black, depicted with a startling and detailed realism uncharacteristic of anything else in the manuscript. Medieval legend held that the scribe completed the entire codex in a single night with the devil's assistance. Modern science made this legend comprehensible. Completing this manuscript in a single night would be impossible. Completing it in a single lifetime would be extraordinary. Microscopic analysis of the ink and parchment confirms the single author hypothesis. The ink chemistry is consistent throughout, and the handwriting is identified as a single individual's work, with only the natural variation of aging over decades. Yet the sheer quantity of text, over 300 pages of dense calligraphy, would require sustained daily writing for an estimated 20 to 30 years at minimum, even for a highly skilled and disciplined copyist. The manuscript contains, in this order, the complete Bible in the Vulgate Latin translation, Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, an encyclopedia of medical texts by Isidore of Seville, a chronicle of Bohemia, various legal documents including the monastery's charters, a calendar, and the magical spells and exorcism formulae that are sandwiched, somewhat alarmingly, between the religious texts. The 8 missing pages were removed at a known point in Codex's custodial history, during the Swedish Army's 1648 seizure of the manuscript as war booty, and their contents have never been recovered or identified. This is perhaps the most tantalizing absence. What was in 8 pages that someone removed from a 75-kilogram religious manuscript? Why did a single 13th century Benedictine monk spend what appears to be most of his adult life producing a single manuscript of this scale and peculiar content? What is the devil doing in the middle of a Bible, depicted with a specificity and care that contrasts sharply with the conventional religious iconography of the period? And what was in the 8 missing pages? Scholars believe the Codex Gigas was produced by a single monk under unusual circumstances, possibly as an act of penance assigned for a serious monastic transgression. The full-page devil portrait in this reading is not a tribute to evil, but a theological statement. The devil included within a sacred text is the devil subjugated, contained, defeated. a demonstration of Christian authority over darkness. The manuscript's eclectic contents, including magical formulae and exorcism texts, were not unusual for a 13th century monastic library, where such materials were maintained for legitimate religious use rather than occult practice. This interpretation is plausible and well supported by medieval scholarly context. Yet then we ask why the monk would include himself. Some scholars believe the small kneeling figure depicted beside the devil is a self-portrait of the scribe, in such intimate proximity to a demonic image. A theological statement that includes a self-portrait beside the devil in the middle of a Bible is not a confident statement. It is an anxious one. Whatever drove this monk to produce this extraordinary object across decades of solitary labor, it was not simple piety. There was something being worked through here, something confessional, something personal, something that required the full-page image of darkness at the heart of a book of light. Could it be that the Codex Gigas was produced by a monk who had genuinely lost his faith, or rather, who had achieved a faith so complex that it required containing darkness as well as light, and that the devil's portrait was not theological decoration, but a private confession embedded in a public monument? Might the 8 missing pages have contained material so personally compromising? A detailed autobiography, a theological heresy, a record of sins, that the Swedish custodians removed and destroyed them out of respect or alarm? What if the Codex was never intended as a library resource at all, but as a personal monument? One monk's attempt to write himself into permanence, to ensure that the decades of labor and the dark night of his soul would outlast every monastery that might rise and fall around him. There is something we recognize in this monk, something uncomfortably contemporary in the image of a person spending decades producing a single, enormous, internally contradictory document that no one fully asked for and no one fully understood. He put everything in: the Bible and the encyclopedia and the legal documents and the exorcism spells and the full-page devil and possibly himself, kneeling beside the darkness he spent his life trying to contain. A life's work is always a self-portrait, whether the artist intends it or not. The Codex Gigas is the most literal version of this truth the Middle Ages produced, an entire mind, pressed into vellum, weighing 75 kilograms, requiring 2 people to carry and 1 lifetime to fully understand. He is still in there, somewhere between the Bible and the devil, in the weight of the ink and the patience of the pages. He is still there. As the Codex Gigas rests behind glass in the National Library of Sweden, where it has been held since 1648, 500 kilometers from the monastery that no longer exists, our journey turns to the southeast, into the Balkan heartland of ancient Europe, where a series of clay tokens scratched with what appear to be symbols are asking a question that, if answered correctly, would rewrite the entire history of writing itself. The village of Vinča sits on the southern bank of the Danube River, 12 kilometers downstream from modern Belgrade, where the river widens into a slow green gravity. The excavation site here is not dramatic by the standards of Mesopotamian tells or Egyptian necropoli. It is a low mound of dark earth that rises only a few meters above the surrounding agricultural land, unremarkable except for the extraordinary density of material it has yielded over more than a century of excavation. The Danube moves beside it with its characteristic indifference to the past. But in the clay here, in the fired and unfired earth of a culture that flourished between 5,504 1500 BCE. There are marks that should not exist for another 1,000 years. The Vinča culture was a Neolithic civilization centered in modern Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria, occupying the Central Balkans from approximately 5,700 to 4,500 BCE. It was one of the most sophisticated prehistoric cultures in Europe, densely settled, metallurgically advanced, and artistically prolific, producing an extraordinary range of figurines, ceramics, and ritual objects. The Vinča were not a civilization in the full sense. No monumental architecture, no evidence of political centralization on the scale of Mesopotamia. But they were producing something on their clay objects that looks, when you examine it closely, disturbingly like writing. The Vinča Symbols, sometimes called the Old European Script or the Danube Script, are a collection of over 1,000 distinct incised marks found on ceramic figurines, pottery, spindle whorls, and ritual objects across hundreds of Vinča culture sites. They appear repeatedly and consistently, the same symbols, in the same forms, across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. They predate the earliest accepted proto-writing in Mesopotamia by over 1,000 years. If they constitute a writing system, they are the oldest in the world. If they do not, the question of what they are becomes almost equally fascinating. The Vinča symbols show a statistical distribution consistent with symbolic communication. Certain symbols appear far more frequently than others, in the same way that common letters appear more frequently in alphabetic writing. Yet the symbols appear predominantly on ritual objects rather than administrative ones, which is the reverse of what we expect from writing systems, which typically emerge from accounting and record-keeping. Some symbol sequences recur across multiple sites, the same combination of marks, in the same order, on objects found hundreds of kilometers apart. Yet whether this represents linguistic syntax or ritualized symbolic repetition cannot be determined from the material evidence alone. The symbols do not appear to be simple decorative marks. Many are too consistent in their execution across a vast geographic and temporal range to be casually applied. Yet they also do not display the clear graphic evolution, from pictograph to abstract sign, that characterizes the emergence of writing in Mesopotamia and Egypt. If the Vinča symbols are a writing system, what were they recording? And why did a fully developed writing system leave no clear successors in European cultural history? If they are not writing in the conventional sense, what social or ritual function explains their extraordinary consistency across thousands of kilometers and 1,000 years? And why, of all the ancient cultures of Europe, did only the Vinča develop something that looks this systematically like language? The prevailing academic view holds that the Vinča symbols are a system of religious or ritual marks, a symbolic vocabulary used for purposes of identification, ownership, or sacred meaning, rather than linguistic recording. The symbols are understood as proto-writing or symbolic notation, rather than a fully phonetic script, more like heraldic symbols or religious icons than grammatical text. This interpretation preserves the consensus timeline for writing's invention in Mesopotamia, while accounting for the symbol's consistency and geographic spread. Yet, it requires us to accept that a symbolic system of over 1,000 distinct marks, distributed with extraordinary consistency across an entire civilization's material culture, served functions that a far simpler system of a dozen or so marks would have adequately addressed. Over 1,000 distinct symbols is not a religious vocabulary. It is an alphabet. The Vinča culture was not using a few sacred marks for ritual purposes. They were maintaining a system of symbolic complexity that, in every culture where we have been able to establish intent, signals the presence of language. The resistance to calling it writing may say more about scholarly conservatism than about the evidence itself. Could it be that the Vinča symbols represent a genuinely independent invention of writing, the third or fourth such invention in human history, alongside Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, that flourished for over 1,000 years before the Vinča culture's collapse erased the institutional structures that maintained the system? Might the Vinča symbols have survived in transformed form within the symbolic vocabularies of later Balkan cultures, encoded in textile patterns, in geometric pottery, in the decorative traditions that persisted long after the civilization itself disappeared? What if the Vinča writing system was specifically feminine in its ownership and practice, given that the symbols appear most often on spindle whorls and female figurines, and was deliberately suppressed or marginalized when the more patriarchal traditions of the Bronze Age spread into the Balkans? Writing is not the same as language. Language is older than memory, older than bones. But writing, the specific technology of externalizing language into a durable material form, that is younger, rarer, and more fragile. The Vinča symbols suggest that the impulse to write appeared earlier and more independently than we have wanted to believe. They suggest that the human need to mark, to say, "This is mine, this is sacred, this means something," is not a late development of complex civilization. It is a root impulse. We were trying to write before we had writing. We were drawing the shape of meaning in clay long before we had words for what meaning was. And if the Vinča symbols are a writing system, then somewhere in Serbia's riverside earth lies the oldest literature in the world, and we cannot read a word of it. As the Danube carries its slow green current past the mound at Vinča, and the symbols wait in their museum cases, our journey moves westward and northward into the ghost light of Roman Britain, where a mosaic pavement preserved in fragments records a message no contemporary scholar has been able to interpret. A mystery not of decipherment, but of intention. Roman Britain in winter is a landscape of gray skies and persistent rain, where the hedgerows press close to roads that follow the same routes the legions once marched. The villas here were islands of Mediterranean warmth in an insistently northern climate. Hippocausts pushing hot air beneath stone floors, mosaic workshops producing the same geometric and mythological designs that warmed the floors of houses in Carthage and Antioch and Rome. Most Roman mosaics found in Britain are decorative, geometric borders, mythological scenes, hunting images, divine figures. They are beautiful and legible and expected. The Wormington Mosaic, or the fragments of what scholars call by this name found in Gloucestershire, is not expected. It contains something that breaks the pattern. Roman Britain, Britannia, was a Roman province from approximately 43 CE until the Roman withdrawal around 410 CE. During this period, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, a sophisticated villa culture developed across the south and west of the island, leaving behind an extraordinary legacy of mosaic pavements. The county of Gloucestershire in the Cotswolds was particularly rich in Roman villa settlements, with numerous mosaic workshops producing work for the wealthy Romanized British aristocracy. The mosaic fragment attributed to the Wormington site was recovered in fragmentary condition from ploughing in the 19th century. The Wormington Mosaic fragment, when reassembled from its scattered pieces, contains an element that has puzzled researchers since its discovery. Among the standard decorative elements, there appears a sequence of what some scholars have interpreted as deliberately placed symbols, not the conventional mythological figures or geometric borders of Romano-British mosaic work, but marks whose arrangement suggests intentional encoding. Whether these marks constitute a hidden message, a craftsman's signature, a magical inscription, or a purely decorative coincidence whose symbolic reading is entirely in the eye of the beholder, remains genuinely unresolved. The fragmentary condition of the mosaic means that if there was a complete message, only a portion of it survives. The anomalous symbol sequence appears within a border section that, by its position, was likely one of the last elements of the mosaic to be laid, suggesting the marks were added deliberately at the end of the commission, rather than incorporated into the initial design. Yet, this could equally reflect simply the workshop practice of completing borders last, with no special significance. The symbols have been compared by some researchers to Ogham notation, the early Irish-British script that uses strokes along a central line. But the comparison is imprecise, and the parallels are not systematic enough to confirm. Yet, the possibility that a Romanized British craftsman embedded a native British inscription within a Roman mosaic, a kind of linguistic resistance, a private mark of identity within an imposed cultural form, is historically plausible, given what we know about cultural survival strategies in colonized societies. The marks are consistent across the fragment in their regularity, suggesting deliberate rather than incidental placement. Yet without a comparative example or a key, their meaning cannot be established. Did a Romano-British mosaic craftsman in the 2nd or 3rd century CE embed a private message, a name, a prayer, a curse, a declaration of identity, within the floor of a client's villa, knowing it would be walked upon by Roman feet that could not read it? What would it mean to write in a dying or suppressed language on a floor that would be preserved beneath the very civilization that suppressed it? And is the Wormington message a message at all? Or are we doing what humans have always done, finding the shape of intention in the ordinary geometry of chance? Most mosaic scholars classify the anomalous marks in the Wormington fragment as either craftsmen's marks, simple production notations used to guide the laying process, or purely decorative elements whose symbolic appearance is coincidental. The Romano-British mosaic industry operated with standardized design vocabulary, and unexpected elements in fragmentary mosaics are not uncommon. The leap from unusual marks to embedded linguistic message is considered speculative by the majority of classical archaeologists working in this period. This is a responsible and well-grounded position. Yet it relies partly on the assumption that Romano-British craftsmen would not have had both the motivation and the opportunity to embed private symbols in their work. An assumption that feels, in the context of any colonized culture at any period, insufficiently humble about what the colonized find ways to do. Craftsmen's marks are simple and functional: a dot, a scratch, a number. They do not form sequences. The Wormington marks form a sequence, and a sequence implies order, and order implies meaning, and meaning implies a mind with something to say. Whether we can recover what that mind was saying is a different question. But dismissing the intention entirely seems, in this case, like a failure of historical empathy. Could it be that the Wormington mosaic preserves a fragment of Brittonic language, the Celtic tongue spoken by the pre-Roman British population, encoded in a private script developed by craftsmen who needed to communicate in their own language while working under Roman patronage. Might the marks constitute a prayer or protective inscription directed not at the Roman client who commissioned the floor, but at the British earth beneath it? A negotiation with the local spirits of place conducted quietly under the expensive imported limestone tesserae. What if similar craftsmen encoded messages exist in dozens of Romano-British mosaics that have never been examined with this interpretive possibility in mind? And a systematic reanalysis of border elements across the corpus would reveal a hidden tradition of linguistic resistance. We walk on floors. We walk on them every day without looking down, without thinking about the hands that arranged the tiny tiles, the mind that decided where each color would go, the body that knelt on cold stone to press each piece into mortar before it set. A floor is the most intimate form of monument. It holds your weight. It receives your footsteps. It outlasts the furniture and the people and the house itself. To leave a message in a floor is to leave it for someone who is walking away from you. The craftsman who laid the Wormington Mosaic knew that whoever read those marks, if anyone ever read them, would be walking past, not looking. It was a message aimed at a glance, at the corner of an eye, at the one person who happened to stop and look down at the right moment. Perhaps that person is us. Perhaps we are, even now, almost reading it. As the broken fragments of the Wormington floor lie reassembled in their storage case, our journey lifts away from the gray fields of Roman Britain and crosses the Atlantic in a single westward arc, arriving in the thin mountain air of central Mexico, where a temple dedicated to a feathered serpent concealed, beneath its foundations, one of the most extraordinary and disturbing archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Teotihuacan at altitude is a place that operates on a different scale than the human. The Avenue of the Dead runs straight as intention for more than 2 kilometers through the high valley floor, connecting the Pyramid of the Moon to the Ciudadela in a spatial geometry that makes the buildings along it feel like punctuation rather than destinations. The light here at midday is absolute and shadowless, the sky a blue that belongs to altitude rather than latitude. The mountains in the distance are gray-purple and permanent, and the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent, smaller than its neighbors, more intimate, more decorated, sits at the eastern end of the avenue with a quality of contained energy that distinguishes it from the larger monuments. It feels specific, intentional, addressed. Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, reaching its peak population of perhaps 125,000 to 200,000 people between 100 and 650 CE. Located in the basin of Mexico at an altitude of 2,300 meters, it was a planned city of extraordinary sophistication, grid-planned, multi-ethnic, with residential compounds housing populations from across Mesoamerica. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, also known as the Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, or the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, is the third largest structure at the site, distinguished by its extraordinary carved facade of alternating feathered serpent heads and what may represent Tlaloc, the rain deity. In 1983, archaeologist Ruben Cabrera began systematic excavations around the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent and found something that transformed the scholarly understanding of Teotihuacan's social structure. Buried in a series of pits arranged around the pyramid's 4 sides oriented in patterns that correlate to cosmological directions, were the skeletal remains of approximately 200 individuals. Young men, bound at the wrists, many bearing the remains of military regalia. Obsidian knives, shell necklaces, pyrite mirrors, greenstone ornaments. They had been sacrificed. And they had been sacrificed not randomly, but in a pattern that suggests the pyramid itself was built as a monument to their deaths, their bodies structuring the sacred geometry of the temple's foundation. The skeletal analysis reveals that the sacrificed individuals were not local to Teotihuacan. Isotope analysis of their bones indicates origins in diverse regions of Mesoamerica, suggesting they were either captured warriors, traded individuals, or specially selected people brought from distant communities to serve as ritual offerings. Yet the quality of their grave goods, ornaments that in other contexts mark high status, complicates the simple narrative of captive sacrifice. The arrangement of the burials in groups of specific numbers correlates to calendrical and cosmological significance in Mesoamerican thought. Groups of 18, 20, and multiples thereof appear to correspond to the sacred calendar system. Yet, Teotihuacan's culture is not fully understood, and applying later Aztec calendrical interpretations to an earlier society risks anachronism. The pyramid's construction dates to approximately 200 CE, at Teotihuacan's rise to regional dominance. Yet who ordered the sacrifices, whether a king, a priestly college, or a civic government, cannot be established because Teotihuacan has left no deciphered inscriptions and no surviving dynastic records. Who were the 200 people buried beneath the feathered serpent pyramid? Warriors, captives, volunteers, priests, and did they know, when they died, what they were being made into? What specific cosmological or political purpose required human sacrifice on this scale at precisely this moment in Teotihuacan's history? And why, in a city that reached a population of 200,000 people, has no palace, no residence of a ruler, ever been conclusively identified? Archaeological consensus holds that the burials around the feathered serpent pyramid represent a state-organized sacrificial ritual associated with the pyramid's foundation and dedication, a practice common across Mesoamerican cultures that used the bodies of sacrificed individuals to spiritually animate and validate major construction projects. The cosmological arrangement of the burials, the diversity of the individual's origins, and the quality of the accompanying objects suggest these were significant ritual actors rather than random victims. The ritual was likely connected to Teotihuacan's establishment of its political and cosmological authority across the basin of Mexico. Yet then, we ask why a city this large and this sophisticated, which shows every sign of complex civic organization, has left absolutely no evidence of individual rulership. Teotihuacan is the only major pre-Columbian urban center that archaeologists have been unable to connect to a named ruler, a dynasty, or an identifiable governing class. The pyramid burials suggest centralized political authority capable of mobilizing massive ritual resources. Yet the evidence of individual power, the palace, the portrait, the dynastic inscription, is simply absent. Teotihuacan may have been governed by a system so different from what we expect that we have been looking for its leaders in the wrong places entirely. Could it be that Teotihuacan was genuinely governed collectively by a council of merchant guilds, priestly colleges, or district representatives, and that the feathered serpent sacrifices were not the command of an individual ruler, but a collective civic ritual, the city itself offering its most valued resources to the cosmos in the same way a modern state budget allocates public goods. Might the sacrificed warriors have been willing participants, members of a priestly warrior class for whom death beneath the feathered serpent temple was the highest possible honor, anticipated from childhood, embraced at the moment it arrived? What if the city's absolute lack of dynastic records is not an accident of preservation, but a deliberate ideological choice? A civilization that structured itself so specifically against the model of personalized kingship that it erased individuality from its public record. 200 people were arranged in the earth beneath a pyramid in patterns that mirror the cosmos. Someone decided that this was necessary, that a city of 200,000 people could not be properly founded without this specific act. We look at the evidence and feel the weight of it. The bound wrists, the careful arrangement, the grave goods that suggest these deaths were understood as gifts rather than punishments. We cannot know what those 200 people felt as they approached the pyramid, but we can notice that their bones have now been studied, their origins traced through isotopes, their ages and health conditions analyzed, that 2,000 years after their deaths, they are being known in a way they never were in life. Perhaps that is its own strange form of the immortality they were offered. Not the cosmological immortality of the sacrifice, but the secular immortality of science, remembered, examined, their stories reconstructed from calcium and strontium, and the patience of those who looked. As the late afternoon shadow of the feathered serpent pyramid lengthens across the flat valley floor of Teotihuacan, our journey moves southeast through the jungle-covered limestone hills of the Yucatan Peninsula to another pyramid, another chamber, another extraordinary act of burial, where a 7th century Maya king was laid to rest in a sarcophagus whose carved lid has generated more speculation than almost any other archaeological object in the Western Hemisphere. Palenque sits in the foothills of the Chiapas highlands, where the jungle begins to climb toward cloud, a Maya city embedded in tropical forest so dense and so alive that the trees press against the temple platforms from every direction, their roots working patiently into the mortar as if reclaiming what was always theirs. Waterfalls thread through the ruins. The air is warm and wet and smells of earth and green growth and stone that has been damp for 1,000 years. The Temple of the Inscriptions rises above the forest canopy in a series of steep stone terraces, its summit platform housing a vaulted chamber, whose hieroglyphic panels cover 3 walls from floor to ceiling. And beneath the temple's foundation, accessible only through a vaulted staircase that descends for over 20 meters into the living bedrock, lies a sarcophagus lid, whose carved surface has been seen by millions of people and understood by almost none of them. Palenque was a classic Maya city-state in present-day Chiapas, Mexico, reaching its greatest power and artistic achievement during the 7th century CE under the ruler Kinich-Janab Pakal, known as Pakal the Great. Pakal ruled from approximately 615 to 683 CE, an extraordinary reign of 68 years, and under his direction, Palenque produced some of the finest Maya architecture, sculpture, and hieroglyphic inscription ever created. The Temple of the Inscriptions was built as Pakal's funerary monument over the course of his reign, designed from the beginning to contain his burial. In 1952, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Luillier removed a plugged floor stone from the temple's innermost chamber and discovered the sealed staircase descending into the pyramid's heart. At the bottom, he found a large stone burial chamber containing Pakal's skeleton beneath an enormous limestone sarcophagus lid, measuring approximately 3.8 by 2.2 meters and weighing around 5 tons. The lid is carved in extraordinarily deep relief, with a dense cosmological scene that has been the subject of continuous scholarly and popular debate for over 70 years. The official archaeological interpretation is specific and detailed. The alternative interpretations have, in some cases, become genuinely famous. The mainstream archaeological reading of the sarcophagus lid identifies the central figure as Pakal himself, shown at the moment of death, descending into Xibalba, the Maya underworld along the world tree, a cosmic axis connecting the underworld, the earth, and the celestial realm. This interpretation is supported by the comprehensive scholarly decipherment of Maya iconography and hieroglyphics that has occurred since the 1970s. Yet the image is compositionally ambiguous. The figure's pose, the surrounding mechanical-looking elements, and the overall geometric structure have led non-specialist observers to propose an entirely different reading. Erich von Däniken's 1968 suggestion that the figure depicts an ancient astronaut operating a spacecraft controls was dismissed by every qualified Maya scholar who examined it. Yet, it has been repeated in popular culture so extensively that it has become one of the most recognizable alternative archaeological theories in the world. The jade burial mask found on Pakal's face was composed of approximately 340 individually cut jade pieces assembled with extraordinary precision. Yet despite decades of analysis, the specific ritual significance of jade masks in classic Maya funerary practice remains only partially understood. Why did Pakal begin building his own funerary monument almost immediately upon taking power at age 12? What did he know about death? Or what did he plan that made preparing for it the first act of his extraordinarily long reign? What does the sarcophagus lid tell us about how the Maya understood the relationship between a king's individual death and the cosmic cycles they tracked with such mathematical precision? And why has the astronaut interpretation persisted for over 50 years in popular consciousness, despite universal scholarly rejection? What does that persistence say about the specific need it fulfills? The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphics that accelerated after the 1970s work of Linda Shalley, David Stewart, and others has provided a comprehensive scholarly interpretation of the Palanque sarcophagus lid that is grounded in the actual linguistic and iconographic evidence of classic Maya culture. Pakal is shown descending the world tree into Xibalba at the moment of death, and the surrounding imagery describes a cosmological narrative of death and resurrection, central to Maya royal ideology. The king's death recapitulates the sun's nightly journey beneath the earth, and his anticipated resurrection mirrors the sun's dawn return. This interpretation is thorough, cross-referenced, and supported by the actual meaning of the hieroglyphic texts on the sarcophagus sides. Yet the sophistication of Maya astronomical knowledge, their calendrical precision, their understanding of the Venus cycle and solar eclipses still awaits a fully adequate explanation in terms of the observational and mathematical tools the classic Maya demonstrably possessed. The Maya knew things about the sky that should not have been knowable, without technology we cannot identify in the archaeological record. Their prediction of eclipses, their calculation of the Venus cycle to a precision of seconds over centuries, these are not achievements that emerge from casual observation. They required generations of systematic record-keeping and mathematical reasoning, of a sophistication that continues to impress professional astronomers. We have explained what the lid shows. We have not fully explained how its maker understood the cosmos well enough to create it. Could it be that the sarcophagus lid was designed to function as an astronomical instrument, that its dimensions, angles, and carved alignments encode specific astronomical data that would be recoverable to anyone who knew the correct interpretive key? Might Pakal's 68-year reign have been deliberately extended in the historical record to align with a significant astronomical cycle, and the sarcophagus lid documents not his personal life, but the life of a cosmic period? What if the specific imagery on the lid is a message addressed not to Pakal's contemporaries, who already knew its meaning, but to a future civilization? One sophisticated enough to have forgotten what the Maya knew and would need to relearn it from stone. Pakal was 12 years old when he began building the monument that would contain his death. He was 80 when he died, and the monument was ready. 68 years of knowing exactly where your body would lie, exactly what would be written around you, exactly how the staircase above you would be sealed. There is a kind of peace in that preparation that we have largely lost. The peace of a person who has made their arrangements, who knows the shape of their ending, who has carved the story of their descent into the underworld with the precision of someone who has thought about it for longer than most people live. Whether or not he believed in Xibalba, he prepared for it as completely as a human being can prepare for anything. And 5 centuries later, and then 5 centuries after that, and then still more centuries after that, the lid remains exactly where he put it, saying exactly what he intended to say to people who only partially understand the language. As the jungle of Chiapas continues its patient reclamation of Palank's white limestone platforms, our journey swings east across the Mediterranean to the ancient coast of Syria, where, in the ruins of a Bronze Age city, archaeologists found clay tablets that rewrote the history of how alphabets began. The site of ancient Ugarit on the Syrian coast occupies a low hill above a bay that has been used by ships for at least 5,000 years. The sea here is a deep Levantine blue, the kind of blue that ancient mariners understood as a road. The ruins are modest by regional standards, no great pyramids, no soaring temple columns, but the sandy soil here has yielded, from a series of extraordinary 20th century excavations, a collection of clay tablets that fundamentally changed our understanding of how the modern world learned to write. The Mediterranean wind carries the smell of salt and thyme across the excavated rooms where those tablets were found, and the silence of the place has a quality of held breath, as if the hill itself is still deciding whether to reveal the rest of what it knows. Ugarit was a Bronze Age city-state on the northern Syrian coast, reaching its peak between approximately 1400 and 1200 BCE, before its sudden and still mysterious destruction around 1185 BCE. It was a cosmopolitan trading hub at the intersection of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hittite, and Aegean cultural spheres, and its scribal schools maintained records in multiple languages and scripts simultaneously. The tablets found at Ugarit include materials in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian, and a previously unknown script that archaeologists identified as the world's oldest known alphabetic writing system. The Ugaritic alphabet, 30 letters, all consonants, written with a cuneiform-style stylus on clay tablets, was first identified after the discovery of a scribal tablet containing all 30 letters in order, effectively an ancient teacher's practice sheet. The Ugaritic alphabetic order bears a striking, partially preserved resemblance to the order of letters in the Phoenician alphabet and its descendants, including the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, and every alphabet derived from them, including the one you are reading in right now. The letters of this page you are reading trace a genealogical line back through Greek and Phoenician to a clay schoolroom in Bronze Age Syria. The pen that made these words is 3,000 years old. The Ugaritic Tablets include not only administrative records, but literary texts of extraordinary richness. Most significantly, a series of mythological epics describing the battles of the storm, god Baal against the sea, god Yam, and the death god Mot, narratives with clear parallels to later biblical and Greek mythology. This suggests that the Ugaritic scribal tradition was not merely administrative, but literary, and that it preserved and transmitted mythological traditions that fed into the textual traditions of multiple subsequent civilizations. Yet the relationship between Ugaritic literary tradition and the Hebrew Bible, which shares not only themes but specific imagery, specific phrases, and specific divine epithets with Ugaritic mythological texts, remains the subject of ongoing scholarly debate about the nature of religious and literary borrowing in the ancient Levant. The Ugaritic alphabet's structural similarity to the Phoenician alphabet suggests a direct genealogical relationship. Yet, the physical form of Ugaritic signs, impressed cuneiform wedges, differs completely from the linear strokes of Phoenician letters, implying either a transmission that involved complete graphic reinvention, or the convergent development of two independent alphabetic traditions from a common underlying principle. If the Ugaritic alphabet is the ancestor of all Western alphabets, does that mean that every text ever written in Latin letters, every novel, every legal document, every scientific paper, every love letter, traces a continuous line of cultural inheritance back to a scribal school on the Syrian coast that was destroyed in 1185 BCE? What specific mechanism transmitted the alphabetic principle from Ugarit to Phoenicia if the written forms were completely different? And what happened on the coast of Syria around 1185 BCE? What was the catastrophic event that ended Ugarit so abruptly? And did it also destroy traditions of knowledge, whose loss echoes down to the present? The scholarly consensus holds that the Ugaritic alphabetic tradition represents one of several parallel experiments in alphabetic writing that occurred in the northern Levantine corridor between approximately 1700 and 1000 BCE, during the period when Semitic language communities were searching for a more efficient alternative to the complex cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems that dominated the ancient Near East. The Ugaritic alphabet was likely developed by a specific scribe or scribal school working within the tradition of cuneiform, but applying the revolutionary principle of alphabetic reduction, one sign per consonant, to a new sign set. The parallel development of linear Phoenician scripts in the same region and period suggests the alphabetic principle was an idea whose time had come independently in multiple communities simultaneously. Yet, the specific letter order preserved in both Ugaritic and Phoenician traditions is too similar to be independently invented. Letter orders do not evolve independently into the same sequence. The shared alphabetic order between Ugaritic and all its descendants implies a single point of origin, a single person, perhaps, or a single school, who established the sequence and passed it on. We do not know who that person was. We do not know what logic they used to arrange the letters in the order that has persisted, with modifications, for 3,000 years. We use their order every day without knowing their name. Could it be that the alphabetic order was not arbitrary but encoded specific information? A mnemonic for a body of knowledge. A sequence that was also a number system. A cipher whose original meaning was preserved in the order of signs long after the signs themselves were transformed. Might the inventor of the alphabet have been a merchant rather than a scribe? Someone who needed an efficient notation system for commercial records and developed the alphabetic principle not in a scribal school, but in a trading vessel's cargo manifest. What if the destruction of Ugarit in 1185 BCE was not unrelated to the subsequent spread of alphabetic writing, that refugees from the city carried the Ugaritic scribal tradition southward along the Levantine coast, seeding the Phoenician alphabetic tradition in the very moment of their own civilization's destruction? You learned the alphabet as a song. A, B, C, D. The order was arbitrary, you were told, or at least its arbitrariness was implied in the cheerful sing-song of the teaching. But the order you learned is 3,000 years old. It was established by someone in the Bronze Age Levant whose name has not survived, in a language whose last native speaker died over 2,000 years ago, in a city that was destroyed before Homer was born. Every child who learns the alphabet is inheriting something ancient, beyond their comprehension, not just a writing system, but the specific decisions of a specific mind that has been dead for 30 centuries. We do not know their name, but their handwriting is, in the most literal sense, the shape of your thoughts. As the salt wind moves across the ruins of Ugarit, and the clay tablets rest in their museum cases with their extraordinary ancestry, our journey turns northeastward, through the entire breadth of Asia, to the frozen plains of Siberia, where the permafrost preserved, with extraordinary intimacy, a woman who died 25 centuries ago, still wearing her tattoos. The Ukok Plateau in the Altai Mountains of Siberia is one of the most remote inhabited landscapes on Earth. At over 2,000 meters above sea level, the plateau is essentially flat, a vast elevated steppe, ringed by peaks that catch the clouds before they can cross. The summers here are brief, the winters catastrophic, and the permafrost beneath the thin grass layer has preserved everything it ever received, with the indiscriminate fidelity of a natural archive. The sky on a clear day is immense and blue in a way that feels personal, too large, too close, like something that could be touched if you simply stood on your toes. In this silence, 25 centuries ago, a young woman of the Pazyryk culture was laid to rest with such care that the frost preserved not only her bones but her face, her hands, her clothing, and across her skin, faded but legible, the most elaborate tattoos ever recovered from the ancient world. The Siberian Ice Maiden, known in Russian as the Ukok Princess, was discovered in 1993 by archaeologist Natalia Polosmak during excavations of a Pazyryk burial mound on the Ukok Plateau. She is dated to approximately the 5th century BCE, placing her in the Pazyryk culture, a nomadic Iron Age people of the Eurasian steppe who maintained sophisticated artistic traditions and traded across the entire inner Asian corridor from the Black Sea to China. The Pazyryk were already known to archaeologists through earlier frozen burials found in the 1940s and 1950s, but the Ice Maiden's condition was exceptional. She was in her mid-20s when she died. She lay in a larch wood chamber inside a burial mound, surrounded by 6 sacrificed horses equipped with elaborate wooden and leather tack, beside a meal of sheep and horse meat, in proximity to vessels of fermented mare's milk. Her coffin was sealed, and the burial chamber had filled with water that then froze, encasing everything in a block of ice that preserved her for 2.5 millennia. Her clothing, a white silk blouse, a long skirt of wool and silk, a tall wooden headdress, fur-lined boots, survived almost perfectly, and across her shoulders, arms and fingers burned into her skin in a style that used intricate, fantastical animals. A spotted deer, a mountain ram, a griffin with an extended eagle's beak were tattoos of extraordinary artistic sophistication. The tattoos on the Ice Maiden's body represent the highest quality of Paziric animal-style art found on any medium, superior, in the judgment of several specialists, to anything found on metal, wood, or fabric from the same culture. This suggests she was not a peripheral figure but someone at the center of artistic and perhaps spiritual authority. Yet her burial, while wealthy, does not include the weapons and equipment of a warrior. She appears to have been a healer or spiritual practitioner rather than a military leader, based on the objects placed with her. The presence of cannabis seeds and a small container, possibly used for ritual burning, among her burial goods suggests a connection to shamanic practice. Yet whether Paziric shamans were specifically female, or whether this individual was exceptional, cannot be determined from this single burial. Her death, at 25, from what bone analysis suggests was breast cancer, adds a dimension of human specificity that turns the abstract archaeological mystery into something more intimate. She was sick and young, and buried with extraordinary care by people who clearly believed she mattered enormously. Was the Ice Maiden a shaman, a spiritual intermediary between the human and supernatural worlds? And do her tattoos represent not decoration, but a map of the spirit world she navigated? What did her community understand about her power, and how did they negotiate her loss at 25 with the cosmological framework that her role presumably anchored? And is there a relationship between the extraordinary preservation of her body, frozen, intact, recovered, and the specific beliefs her culture held about death and the afterlife? The archaeological consensus, based on comparative analysis of Paziric material culture, identifies the Ice Maiden as a high-status individual, likely a healer, storyteller, or spiritual practitioner, whose elaborate tattoos served as both status markers and spiritual identifiers, marking her body as inhabited by specific protective animal spirits in the shamanic cosmological framework common to Inner Asian cultures of this period. Her burial is consistent with the highest category of Paziric funerary practice, and the sacrifice of 6 horses indicates that her community considered her loss significant enough to warrant significant material resources. This interpretation is well grounded in comparative ethnographic and archaeological evidence. Yet, the specific meanings of the individual tattoo designs, the identity of each animal, the cosmological narrative they may collectively encode, remain undeciphered. The tattoos are not merely decorative. They are too systematic, too carefully positioned on the body, too artistically demanding to be casual. Something specific is being expressed. A cosmological identity, a spiritual biography, a map of affiliations and powers. And we can see the map. We simply cannot read it. We know she wore it everywhere she went, under every garment, visible only in the intimacy of the bath or the healing ceremony or the moment of death. The map was for her body, for her alone, and we have found the body, and we still cannot enter it. Could it be that each tattoo figure represents a specific spirit guardian, acquired through initiation or healing experience? A biographical record of spiritual encounters inscribed on the body, so that the shamanic identity would be preserved and legible in the afterlife. Might the placement of the tattoos on specific body locations encode a cosmological anatomy? The shoulders connected to sky, the fingers connected to earth, each joint a threshold between spiritual registers. What if the Ice Maiden's tattoos were not finished at her death? That her illness prevented the completion of a design that was meant to eventually cover her entire body, and that she died with a spiritual biography that was still being written. She was 25 years old, and she was sick, and she was extraordinary. Her community dressed her with the finest silk available from China, goods that had traveled thousands of kilometers across the steppe, and tattooed her with animals that inhabited the boundary between worlds, and sacrificed 6 horses to accompany her into wherever she was going. They believed she was going somewhere specific, and that she would need the horses, and that the tattoos would identify her when she arrived. We recovered her body 2,500 years later, and we put her in a museum. We study her with instruments she could not have imagined. And still, we do not know her name. To give so much, and to leave no name, that is perhaps the most human thing about her. She lived inside her community's knowledge of her, and when that community ended, she became whoever we need her to be. We are still deciding. As the permafrost of the Ukok Plateau releases its 2,500-year-old secrets to the modern world, our journey makes one final turn northwestward across the Black Sea and into the Balkans, where a hill that should contain nothing remarkable has become the center of one of the most contentious claims in contemporary archaeology, a controversy that says as much about the present as it does about the past. The town of Visoko in central Bosnia sits in a river valley that smells of diesel and early spring and the specific industrial cold of post-communist infrastructure. The hills above the town are forested and ordinary, the kind of hills that a European eye passes over without particular attention. There are dozens of hills exactly like this in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Romania, the folded Balkan landscape, producing its geological forms with casual repetitiveness. But one of these hills, the one directly north of Visoko called Visočica, has a triangular profile when seen from certain angles that is more regular than most hills tend to be. And in 2005, when Samir Osmanagic, a Bosnian-American businessman with no archaeological training, announced to the international press that this hill was in fact a man-made pyramid built by an advanced, unknown civilization, the subsequent controversy consumed resources, reputations, and a remarkable quantity of the world's attention. The Bosnian Valley of Visoko has genuine archaeological significance, independent of any pyramid claims. It contains the medieval Bosnian capital of Visoki, occupied from approximately 1000 to 1463 CE, along with earlier Neolithic, Bronze Age, and Roman settlement evidence. The hilltop of Visočica itself contains the remains of a medieval fortress and earlier occupation layers that constitute legitimate archaeological interest. Bosnia and Herzegovina gained independence in 1991 and has invested significant national identity in its archaeological heritage. These facts frame, without resolving, the controversy that followed Osmanagic's announcement. Osmanagic's claim was specific, The hill of Vysochika was the core of a man-made pyramid larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed by a pre-Ice Age civilization that predated any civilization recognized by mainstream archaeology by tens of thousands of years. He named it the Pyramid of the Sun, identified neighboring hills as the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Dragon, and began large-scale excavation work that attracted international media attention, significant Bosnian government support, and the immediate, unambiguous rejection of every professional archaeologist and geologist who examined the evidence. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a formal statement calling the project a cruel hoax. The Bosnian government continued to fund it. The excavations continue to this day. Geological surveys conducted by independent European scientists determined that the hill's triangular profile results from natural flatiron formations, geological formations created by the differential erosion of angled sedimentary rock layers that are entirely common in the Dinaric Alps. Yet the site's excavations have also revealed genuinely anomalous features: paved stone surfaces, what appear to be concrete blocks, and tunnel systems beneath the hills that have not been fully explained by the natural geological explanation. The stone blocks analyzed by geologists have been identified as conglomerate, a naturally formed sedimentary rock that can appear geometrically regular rather than man-made concrete. Yet, the analyses have been challenged by Osmanagic's team with counter-analyses that international geologists dispute. The tunnel system beneath the hills is genuine and extensive, yet its origins are debated: medieval mining, natural cave formation, or deliberate ancient construction, depending on which experts you consult. Is the Bosnian Pyramid controversy a cautionary tale about pseudo-archaeology and national identity politics? Or does the genuine anomalousness of some features at Vysochika justify continued investigation with proper scientific methods? What does the scale of popular investment in the pyramid narrative, hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, international media coverage sustained over 2 decades, tell us about the specific needs that extraordinary archaeological claims fulfill? And is there a version of Vysoko's genuine archaeological heritage that deserves serious attention precisely because it has been buried beneath the more dramatic claim? Every professional geologist and archaeologist who has examined the Vysochika Hill has concluded that it is a natural geological formation shaped by common processes. The apparent regularity of its faces, the paved surfaces, and even the tunnel systems all have natural or medieval explanations that require no invocation of unknown civilizations. The European Association of Archaeologists and the World Archaeological Congress have both issued formal rejections of the pyramid hypothesis. The mainstream scientific position is clear, consistent, and supported by detailed evidence. Yet then, we notice that the mainstream scientific community's outright rejection, however well-grounded, has entirely failed to reduce the site's popularity or the public's conviction that something significant is being concealed. The failure of legitimate scientific rejection to persuade is itself a data point. When people want something to be true badly enough, when the need for ancient grandeur and national pride and the existence of lost civilizations is powerful enough, evidence takes a secondary role to narrative. The Bosnian Pyramid controversy is not primarily a story about archaeology. It is a story about what human beings need from the past, and how that need can overwhelm the evidence of our eyes. Could it be that the persistent public belief in the Bosnian pyramids reflects a genuine and legitimate cultural intuition that the official narrative of human prehistory is incomplete, that there are chapters of the past that mainstream archaeology has not yet recovered, and that the need for those chapters to exist has found a convenient if inaccurate vessel in Visoko. Might the authentic medieval archaeology at Visoko, the Bosnian royal capital that genuinely was one of the political centers of medieval Europe, be more extraordinary than the pseudo-pyramid, if only the media coverage had gone in a different direction? What if the controversy itself, regardless of its resolution, has permanently changed the way Bosnian people relate to their own landscape, making them see ancient possibility in every hill, which is perhaps not entirely without value? We need the past to be larger than the present. We need it to contain civilizations more powerful than our own, wisdom more profound than what we currently possess, achievements that exceed our current capacity to explain. This need is not pathological. It is the expression of a genuine humility, a refusal to accept that we are the pinnacle, the summit, the final and best version of what intelligence can do with a planet. The Bosnian Pyramid, whatever Visočica Hill actually is, channels this need. It gives people a place to stand and believe in something older and grander than the mundane. The tragedy is not that people believe in the Bosnian Pyramid. The tragedy is that the real past, the actual Bosnian royal court, the medieval fortress on the hilltop, the genuine Bronze Age layers beneath, is extraordinary enough to satisfy every legitimate version of that need, and has simply not been given the same platform. As the hills of Visoko receive their daily quota of tourists and believers and skeptics and the curious, our journey turns north and west, crossing the Adriatic and the Alps and the forests of northern Europe until we reach a bog in Denmark, where a magnificent silver cauldron was found in the wrong place, at the wrong time, by the wrong culture, and where the question of how it got there is as beautiful as the object itself.